The Lion from the North, the Chronicle of Gustavus Adolphus II, and the Forge of Swedish Power. The chamber is cold. Not the gentle cold of autumn mornings when frost glitters on window panes and breath fogs pleasantly in the air, but the penetrating, bone-deep, marrow-freezing cold of a Swedish winter that seeps through stone walls 3 feet thick, that settles into joints and lungs, that makes every breath an effort and every movement painful. The year is 1611, December, the darkest month and the darkest season, when daylight dies before mid-afternoon, and the world feels like it is closing in, suffocating, drowning in endless night. The castle of Nykoping, a fortress of gray stone that squats on the shore of the Baltic Sea, like some ancient predator. A boy stands at the foot of his father's bed. He is 16 years old, tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with the physical bearing of someone who has already spent years training for war. His hair is fair, cut short in the military fashion. His face is young but hard. The softness of childhood, already burned away by discipline and expectation. His name is Gustavus Adolphus. His father is dying. King Carl IX lies beneath heavy furs, bear pelts, wolfskins, layers of wool blankets, and still he shivers. His breathing is labored, each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation a wet, rattling sound that speaks of fluid-filling lungs, of a body that has fought too many battles, endured too much strain, and is now surrendering to the inevitable. The king's face is gray, the color of old snow mixed with ash, the color of death. His eyes, once sharp enough to cut through the pretensions of nobles and the evasions of diplomats, now struggle to focus on the tall figure of his son, standing motionless in the flickering candlelight that casts long shadows across the room. The boy does not move, does not weep, does not reach for his father's hand in a gesture of comfort or farewell. He stands with his shoulders squared, his spine straight, his jaw tight, his blue eyes fixed on the man who is about to leave him with a crown, a kingdom, and 3 wars. 3 wars. The phrase echoes in Gustavus Adolphus's mind like a drumbeat, like the tolling of church bells announcing a death. 3 simultaneous conflicts, each bleeding Swedish manpower, draining Swedish coffers, testing the limits of what this northern kingdom can sustain. Poland to the east, where King Sigismund III, a Catholic zealot who still claims the Swedish throne, wages a religious crusade, disguised as dynastic restoration. Denmark to the south, where King Christian IV, ambitious and aggressive, seeks to reassert Danish dominance over Scandinavia and reclaim territories lost in previous wars. Russia to the northeast, where the time of troubles has left the Tsardom weak and chaotic, creating opportunities for Swedish expansion, but also requiring constant military pressure to maintain gains. 3 wars, 3 fronts, 3 drains on resources that Sweden, with its population of barely 1 million souls, cannot afford to sustain indefinitely. And standing at the center of it all, about to assume the weight of it, is a boy who has never ruled independently, never commanded an army in his own right, never felt the full crushing responsibility of statecraft and survival in a world where weakness invites annihilation. Carl IX's lips move. The sound is almost inaudible, a whisper barely distinguishable from the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. The boy leans closer, not out of filial affection. The relationship between father and son has always been more military than tender, more about training than love, but out of necessity. He needs to hear. He needs to know. The words come in fragments, broken by pauses for breath, by coughs that rack the dying king's body. Names, instructions, and warnings. The chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, can be trusted, but he is too cautious, too willing to compromise. The nobility are vultures who will try to reclaim power the moment they sense weakness. The treasury is nearly empty. The army is stretched thin. Denmark will attack if they sense opportunity. Sigismund will never give up his claim to Sweden. Never trust a man who has not proven his loyalty with action. not just words. Gustavus Adolphus listens without expression, his face a mask, committing each word to memory, filing them away in the disciplined architecture of a mind that has been trained since early childhood for exactly this moment. Since he was 5 years old, he has studied languages, Swedish, German, Latin, Dutch, French, so that he could speak directly to foreign generals, diplomats, and scholars without relying on translators who might shade meanings or conceal truths. Since he was 7, he has studied military history, reading Caesar's commentaries, Vigetius's De Re Militari, contemporary treatises on fortification and siege warfare, absorbing the lessons of ancient and modern commanders. Since he was 10, he has trained physically, riding, fencing, shooting, drilling with weapons, until his hands bled and his muscles screamed, building the stamina and strength that would allow him to endure the brutal campaigns that everyone, including his father, knew awaited him. He has been raised as a weapon, forged like a blade, and now the moment has come to test whether that weapon will hold or shatter. Karl IX's lips move one final time. The words are almost inaudible, but Gustavus Adolphus hears them. Be stronger than I was. Be harder. Never apologize. Never retreat. Sweden survives only if you do not flinch. Then Karl IX stops speaking. His chest rises one final time, hesitates as though his body is reconsidering, weighing whether to continue the struggle or surrender. Then it falls. The rattle ceases. The room becomes impossibly silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the distant howl of wind outside the castle walls. Gustavus Adolphus stands motionless for a long moment. He does not call for attendance. He does not pray, though he is a pious Lutheran who believes deeply in divine providence. He simply looks at the body of his father, the man who seized the Swedish throne through civil war, who executed rivals, who crushed rebellions with systematic brutality, who taught his son that power is not inherited by right of blood, but seized by force, and maintained through vigilance, discipline, and the willingness to do what others will not. When Gustavus Adolphus finally turns and walks from the room, his footsteps echo on the stone floor. Each step is measured, deliberate, the gait of a man who understands that he has just become responsible for the survival of a nation at war with half of Northern Europe, a nation whose enemies smell blood and are circling like wolves around a wounded prey. Outside, snow falls on the castle courtyard, silent, relentless, covering the cobblestones, the battlements, the frozen ground where soldiers drill even in winter, because armies that do not train constantly lose their edge and die. The boy king, for that is what he is now, though he will not be formally crowned for months, stands in the courtyard and watches his breath fog in the winter air. He knows what awaits him. He knows that nobles who hated his father will try to limit his power, will try to force him to rule through a council to make him a figurehead. He knows that Sweden's enemies are watching, waiting to see if the death of Karl IX creates an opportunity to strike, to seize territory, to destroy Swedish independence once and for all. He knows that every decision he makes from this moment forward will be measured in the lives of soldiers and the fate of a kingdom that history has not yet decided deserves to survive. This is where the story begins, not with triumph, not with glory, not with the grand victories that will later make Gustavus Adolphus famous across Europe, but with a 16-year-old standing in the snow, alone, watching his breath fog in the winter air, carrying the weight of 3 wars and a crown that many men would kill to steal from him. The wind howls, the snow falls, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the castle walls, enemies are planning. Armies are marching. The world is moving, indifferent to the death of one Swedish king, curious only to see whether his son will prove strong enough to survive what is coming. Part 1. The blood that built the throne, the rise of House Vasa. To understand Gustavus Adolphus, to truly comprehend the man, the king, the military genius, and the tragic figure he would become, you must first understand where he comes from. You must understand the House of Vasa, the dynasty into which he was born. And most importantly, you must understand the grandfather he never met, but whose shadow stretches across every decision, every military reform, every territorial ambition, every brutal calculation that will define the Swedish Empire and its brief, violent flowering. That grandfather's name was Gustav Eriksson Vasa, and he did not inherit Sweden. He took it. He ripped it from the hands of foreign kings and domestic traitors with nothing but will, cunning, and an understanding of power so ruthless and so clear that it would shape Swedish politics for generations. The year was 1523. Sweden was not a nation in any meaningful sense. It was a geographical expression, a collection of provinces, a periphery, a resource base for Denmark. It was ruled by a Danish king under the framework of the Kalmar Union, a political arrangement created in 1397 that had theoretically united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch. In practice, the Kalmar Union meant Danish dominance. Danish governors administered Swedish provinces. Danish tax collectors extracted Swedish wealth. Danish soldiers enforced Danish law. The Swedish nobility had largely acquiesced to this arrangement because it was profitable for them. They could maintain their estates, their privileges, their local authority, as long as they swore loyalty to the Danish crown and paid their tributes. The common people, the farmers, the miners, the fishermen, the vast majority of Sweden's population, had no say in the matter. They paid taxes to foreign overlords and died in foreign wars, and were told to be grateful for the privilege. Then came a massacre that would change everything. In November of 1520, King Christian II of Denmark, later known as Christian the Tyrant, invited the leading Swedish nobles to a banquet in Stockholm. It was meant to be a celebration, a gesture of reconciliation after years of tension between the Swedish nobility and the Danish crown. Christian had recently suppressed a Swedish revolt led by Sten Sture the Younger, a Swedish regent who had resisted Danish authority. Sten Sture the Younger was dead now, killed in battle, and Christian wanted to consolidate his control over Sweden by making peace with the remaining Swedish leaders. The Swedish nobles came to the banquet. They came because refusing a royal invitation was itself an act of rebellion. They came because they believed in the laws of hospitality that governed medieval political life. Laws that said you did not kill guests under your own roof. Laws that made diplomatic gatherings sacred spaces where violence was unthinkable. They were catastrophically wrong. Christian II had made a calculation. He had decided that Swedish resistance to Danish rule stemmed not from popular discontent, not from national feeling, concepts that barely existed in the early 16th century, but from aristocratic troublemakers who poisoned the minds of the common folk against him for their own selfish political gain. Remove the troublemakers, he reasoned, and resistance would collapse. The Swedish people, leaderless and cowed, would accept Danish rule peacefully. So Christian had the nobles arrested. Right there in the banquet hall, in the middle of the feast, guards seized them, dragged them out into the Stockholm streets while they protested, while they invoked diplomatic immunity, while they cried out for mercy or justice or an explanation. There was no explanation, only execution. Over the next 3 days, more than 80 Swedish nobles, bishops, and civic leaders were beheaded in Stockholm's main square. Their bodies were left in piles as a lesson to anyone who might think to challenge Danish authority. Their heads were displayed on pikes. Blood ran in the streets and pooled in the gutters and attracted dogs and rats that fed on the remains. It became known as the Stockholm bloodbath. And it was, by any measure, a catastrophic miscalculation. Among those executed was Erik Johansson, a Swedish nobleman of some standing, a man who had served as a royal counselor, who had estates in Uppland, who had a wife and children, and a future that Christian II ended with an axe. Erik Johansson had a son. That son was Gustav Eriksson. He was 24 years old in 1520. He had served as a hostage at the Danish court, part of a diplomatic arrangement meant to guarantee Swedish good behavior. When news reached Gustav that his father had been murdered in Stockholm, that the cream of Swedish nobility had been slaughtered like livestock, something ignited in him. Not just rage, though rage was certainly there, hot and consuming and focused, but also calculation, recognition, the sudden, sharp understanding that Christian II had just made a fatal error. By killing the Swedish nobility, Christian had eliminated the class most invested in maintaining the Kalmar Union, the class that profited from cooperation with Denmark. The nobles who survived would be terrified, yes, but also furious. And more importantly, Christian had created a vacuum of leadership that someone bold enough, someone desperate enough, could fill. Gustav Eriksson decided to be that someone. He escaped from the Danish court. The details are murky. Some accounts say he bribed guards, others that he simply walked away during a moment of confusion. But he made it back to Sweden. But Sweden was not waiting with open arms. Danish authority was entrenched in the cities. The castles were in enemy hands. The bishops were cautious. The surviving nobles were either dead, compromised, or afraid. So he went north. He went to Dalarna, the forested, mountainous region of central Sweden, where Danish control was weakest, and where the people were poor, independent, and deeply suspicious of foreign authority. Dalarna was not Stockholm. It was miners in Falun extracting copper that financed kingdoms. It was farmers surviving on thin soil and short summers. It was a region with a long tradition of local autonomy and a deep suspicion of distant rulers, especially foreign ones. Gustav began in the western reaches of the province, in the region where Sälen lies today. He began to speak to them, to the miners who worked the copper and silver deposits that were Sweden's primary export, to the farmers who scratched livings from thin northern soil, to the hunters and trappers and charcoal burners who lived on the margins of society. He told them that Sweden could be free, that they did not have to bow to foreign kings, that they could take back their country if they were willing to fight. It was a gamble. The people of Dalarna had no reason to trust the noblemen. Nobles had failed them before. Nobles collected taxes and demanded labor and gave nothing in return. Nobles lived in comfortable estates while common folk starved. Why should they believe that Gustav Eriksson was different? They listened, yes. They heard his account of the Stockholm bloodbath. They shared his anger at Danish taxes and Danish bailiffs. But they had heard promises from nobles before. They had seen uprisings crushed before. A failed rebellion would not mean exile for them. It would mean execution, confiscation, burned farms, or worse. But Gustav understood something fundamental about power that would define his entire career and shape his descendants' approach to statecraft. That legitimacy is not given by birth or tradition or divine right, but earned through results. He did not ask the people of Dalarna to trust him. He asked them to fight alongside him. He promised that if they won, if they drove the Danes out of Sweden, they would have a king who was Swedish, who understood their lives, who owed his throne to them. It was a radical promise. Medieval kingship did not work that way. Kings ruled by the grace of God, by hereditary right, by ancient bloodlines. They did not owe anything to common people. But Gustav Eriksson was desperate. He had nowhere else to go. No army to command. No wealth to draw on. Just his name, his cause, and his willingness to gamble everything. The miners of Dalarna listened. They debated. But they refused him. So they sent him away. For Gustav, it was a devastating moment. He had no army, no fortress, no treasury. If Dalarna would not rise, there was nowhere left to turn. So he did the only thing he could. He left. It was winter. The snow was deep. The forests were silent, except for the wind. Gustav put on his skis, long wooden planks, the technology of survival in the north, and began the journey eastward toward Mora. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was retreat. If Dalarna would not support him, he would have to try elsewhere. Perhaps in Norway. Perhaps he would disappear into obscurity. But history pivoted on what happened next. After he left, the men of Salem reconsidered. They debated what they had heard. They weighed the risks again, and they realized something essential. If they did nothing, Danish power would only tighten. Taxes would increase. Local autonomy would erode. The execution of the nobles in Stockholm was not a sign of strength. It was a warning of what Christian II was willing to do. They had sent away the only man bold enough to challenge him. So they strapped on their skis. They followed his tracks through the snow, across forest and frozen marsh, along the valleys toward Mora. They pursued him not as subjects chasing a lord, but as free men chasing an opportunity. They caught up with him in Mora. And there in that moment on winter ground, among farmers and miners who had first rejected him and then chosen him, Gustav Eriksson gained his army. Not because he commanded it, because they decided to give it to him. That is the crucial distinction. Medieval kingship was supposed to descend from above. Divine right, hereditary bloodlines, feudal obligation. But here in Dalarna, something different happened. A nobleman who had nothing left appealed directly to common people, and they made a political decision. They would fight. From that moment, the rebellion transformed. What had been a fugitive's gamble became a popular uprising. The miners of Falun joined the rebellion. Parish by parish, men answered the call. They brought what they had: bows and crossbows used for hunting, axes meant for timber, spears fashioned from farm tools. They were not knights. They were not mercenaries. They were not professionals. But they were committed. By 1521, Gustav led a growing force southward. Town by town, he gathered support. Danish garrisons found themselves isolated. The rebellion gained momentum not because it was inevitable, but because it was chosen, repeatedly, by ordinary Swedes. And the memory of that winter journey never faded. 4 centuries later, in 1922, Sweden formalized that memory into something extraordinary: the Vasaloppet. The race runs approximately 90 kilometers from Salem to Mora, retracing the legendary route of Gustav's flight and recall. It is not a minor commemorative event. It is the largest cross-country ski race in the world. Tens of thousands of participants, elite athletes and amateurs, professionals chasing records and families skiing for tradition. It is broadcast nationally. It is a cultural institution. And its origin is not merely athletic. It commemorates the moment when the people of Dalarna changed their minds, when they decided that Sweden would not be ruled passively, when they chose to pursue a fleeing nobleman through snow and forest and place their fate in a shared struggle. The story is not, he talked, and they listened. The story is that they refused him. He left. They reconsidered. They chased him down. And in Mora, in the winter of 1521, a king without a kingdom became the leader of a national uprising. Every skier who pushes off from Salem toward Mora participates in that memory. Every finish in Mora echoes the moment when Gustav Eriksson stopped running and turned back with an army at his side. It is sport, yes. It is endurance. It is national pride. But at its core, it is a reenactment of a political awakening in the snow. The beginning of the rebellion that would end the Kalmar Union, and eventually place Gustav on the throne as king of an independent Sweden. By 1521, he had an army. Not a professional force of knights and mercenaries, not a feudal levy of reluctant peasants, but a ragged, furious, committed force of farmers and laborers and miners who had decided they would rather die fighting than live as serfs to Denmark. They were poorly equipped. They had hunting bows, farming implements turned into weapons, whatever they could scavenge or steal. They had no formal military training. Many had never been in a real battle. But they had something that professional soldiers often lacked. They had a cause they believed in. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. And that made them dangerous. Gustav Eriksson was a natural leader. He was charismatic, yes, But more importantly, he was competent. He understood logistics. He knew that armies march on their stomachs, that a starving soldier is useless, that controlling supply lines matters more than heroic charges. He organized foraging parties. He established supply depots. He turned his mob of angry farmers into something resembling an army. And he was ruthless. When towns refused to support him, he burned them. When suspected Danish sympathizers were caught, he hanged them. When his own followers wavered, when they talked about going home, he reminded them that Denmark would never forgive rebellion, that if they gave up now, they would be hunted down and executed. There was no retreat, only forward. By 1522, Gustav's army controlled most of central Sweden. The Danish garrison in Stockholm was under siege. Other Danish strongholds were isolated, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. King Christian II, facing rebellions in Denmark itself and realizing that Sweden was lost, withdrew his forces. In June of 1523, Gustav Eriksson was elected King of Sweden by the Estates. The Swedish parliament composed of nobles, clergy, burghers, and peasants. Not crowned by divine right, not proclaimed by papal authority. Elected, chosen by representatives of the Swedish people, because he had delivered what he promised, independence. King Gustav I, the founder of the Vasa dynasty, the man who turned a Danish province into an independent kingdom. But winning independence was only the beginning. Keeping it, consolidating it, transforming Sweden from a loose collection of provinces into a coherent nation-state capable of defending itself in a hostile world, that was the work of decades. And it required methods that were brutal, systematic, and utterly without sentimentality. Gustav Vasa, as he became known, ruled for 37 years, from 1523 to 1560. Every single one of those years was a battle. Not always a military battle, though there were plenty of those, but a political and economic battle to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and build a state apparatus capable of surviving in a world where weakness meant extinction. His first target was the Catholic Church. In the early 16th century, the Church was not just a religious institution. It was an economic and political powerhouse. The Church owned perhaps a third of all land in Sweden. Church officials collected tithes from every parish. Monasteries and convents held vast estates. Bishops wielded political authority that rivaled the nobility. Gustav Vasa looked at the Church and saw a rival power structure, an alternative source of authority that could challenge the crown. He also saw enormous wealth that could be redirected to more useful purposes, like paying soldiers and building fortifications and creating a centralized bureaucracy loyal to him rather than to Rome. So he broke the Church. The Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther in 1517, provided ideological cover. Gustav declared that Sweden would become Lutheran. Church lands were secularized, a polite term for confiscated. Monasteries were dissolved. Monks and nuns were expelled. Church silver and gold were melted down and minted into coins to pay the army. Bishops who resisted were removed and replaced with more compliant clergy. This was not about theology. Gustav Vasa was not a reformer driven by spiritual conviction or a deep belief in Luther's 95 Theses. He was a pragmatist who understood that the Church was the only institution in Sweden with resources that rivaled the crown. So he took those resources. Methodically, ruthlessly, systematically. The transition was not peaceful. Catholics resisted. Some clergy preached against the changes, calling Gustav a heretic and a tyrant. In the province of Småland, peasants rose in armed revolt, demanding a return to the old faith. Gustav sent soldiers. The revolt was crushed. Leaders were hanged. Villages were burned as examples. But it was not just Catholics who resisted. The very people who had put Gustav on the throne, the miners and farmers of Dalarna, also rebelled. Multiple times. The first rebellion came in 1527, the Dalarna Rebellion, The miners were angry about taxes. Gustav had promised freedom and prosperity, but instead he was demanding more taxes than the Danes ever had. The miners felt betrayed. They took up arms. Gustav marched north with an army. He did not negotiate. He did not compromise. He crushed the rebellion with systematic brutality. Leaders were executed. Entire villages were put to the torch. Gustav made it clear that gratitude for past service had an expiration date, that obedience was not optional, that rebellion would be met with overwhelming force. There were more rebellions. In 1531, in 1542. Each time, Gustav responded the same way. Overwhelming force. Public executions. The destruction of resistance. He did not apologize. He did not show mercy. He ruled through fear as much as through legitimacy. And he centralized power. Gustav created a system of provincial governors appointed directly by the crown and answerable only to him. These governors collected taxes, enforced laws, raised troops when needed, and reported back to Stockholm. The old feudal system, where nobles held land in exchange for military service and exercised local authority independently, was gradually dismantled. Nobles who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted were stripped of lands and titles. Gustav built a navy. Sweden had always been vulnerable from the sea. Danish warships could raid the coast at will. Gustav commissioned shipyards, hired foreign naval experts, began constructing a Swedish fleet capable of defending Swedish waters and projecting power across the Baltic. He established Sweden's first standing army. Previously, Swedish military forces had been feudal levies, temporary forces raised for specific campaigns and disbanded afterward. Gustav created permanent regiments, paid for by the state, trained year-round, ready to deploy on short notice. He reformed the tax system. Previously, taxes had been collected haphazardly by local officials who often kept a significant portion for themselves. Gustav created a centralized tax collection system, sent royal auditors to verify accounts, and severely punished corruption. The result was that more money actually reached the royal treasury, money that could be used to build infrastructure, pay soldiers, and fund the emerging Swedish state. And he did it all while paranoid, suspicious, and ruthlessly calculating. Gustav Vasa trusted no one, not his nobles, who he believed were always plotting to reclaim their lost privileges, not his advisors, who might have their own agendas, not foreign powers who viewed Sweden as a minor kingdom ripe for exploitation, and not even, in his final years, his own sons. Gustav married 3 times. His first wife, Katarina of Saxe-Lauenburg, gave him 1 son, Eric, before dying. His second wife, Margareta Leijonhufvud, which, by the way, means lionhead, gave him 10 children, of whom 3 sons survived to adulthood, Johann, Magnus, and Karl. His third and final wife, Margareta Stenbock, didn't give him any children. She was only 17 when they married, while Gustav was well in his 40s and was probably suffering from an array of illnesses that might have hindered his ability to sire more children. Gustav loved his children in his way, but he did not trust them. He saw in them the potential for civil war, for succession disputes, for the kind of dynastic conflict that had torn apart other kingdoms. So he tried to control them, to bind them to his will, even from beyond the grave. Gustav is the king responsible for introducing primogeniture into Swedish law. When Gustav died in 1560, he left a detailed will. Eric, his eldest son, would inherit the throne, but Johann and Karl would receive substantial dukedoms, essentially independent territories where they would rule with near-royal authority. But Magnus, his second eldest son from his second marriage with Margareta Leijonhufvud, i.e. his third son in total, Magnus received less because Gustav had assessed him as weak and unsuitable for power. It should have been enough. It was not. Gustav Vasa died believing he had secured Sweden's future. He had turned a collection of provinces into a kingdom. He had broken the power of the church and the feudal nobility. He had created institutions, an army, a navy, a bureaucracy capable of sustaining Swedish independence. He had enriched the crown and left a full treasury. But he also left behind a legacy of absolutism, of centralized power, of political culture, where the king's will was law and dissent was treason. And he left behind sons who had learned those lessons too well, who believed that power was the only thing that mattered, that compromise was weakness, that rivals, even brothers, were enemies to be destroyed. Gustav Vasa's sons inherited his kingdom, and within a generation, they nearly destroyed it. Part 2. The War Between Brothers. How the Vasa dynasty nearly collapsed. Erik XIV became King of Sweden in 1560 when his father died. He was 27 years old, intelligent, cultured, multilingual, interested in art and music and scholarship. He should have been a Renaissance prince, a model of enlightened monarchy. He was also mentally unstable, prone to paranoia, violent mood swings, and increasingly detached from reality. Erik's problems began almost immediately. His brothers, Johann and Karl, controlled vast territories as dukes. They had their own armies, their own administrators, their own treasuries. They ruled their dukedoms almost as independent princes. And Erik, suspicious and insecure, believed they were plotting against him. He was probably right. Johann, Duke of Finland, was ambitious and calculated. He married Katarina Jagiellonica, a Polish princess and sister of King Sigismund II, Augustus of Poland. The marriage was politically significant. It created a potential alliance between Sweden and Poland, two kingdoms that had long been rivals. But it also gave Johann connections, resources, and foreign support that made him dangerous to Erik. Erik saw the marriage as a threat. He believed Johann was planning to use Polish support to overthrow him and seize the Swedish throne. So Erik acted first. In 1563, Erik arrested several Swedish nobles he suspected of conspiring with Johann. He imprisoned them in Uppsala Castle. Then, in a fit of rage and paranoia, Erik personally went to the castle, entered the cells, and murdered the prisoners. He stabbed them to death with a dagger, his hands slick with their blood, his mind unraveling. The nobility recoiled in horror. A king who murdered nobles without trial, who acted on paranoid suspicions, who could not control his own violent impulses. This was not acceptable. This was tyranny of the most dangerous kind. Johann saw his opportunity. He raised an army in Finland, declared himself protector of the realm against Erik's madness, and marched towards Stockholm. Karl, the youngest brother, initially stayed neutral, but eventually sided with Johann. Together, they had the military strength to challenge Erik. The conflict lasted several years. Erik tried to defend his throne, raising armies, forging alliances, attempting to rally support. But his mental state deteriorated. He suffered what contemporaries described as fits of madness, periods where he could not function, where he raged incoherently, where he saw conspiracies everywhere. In 1568, Johann's forces captured Erik. The deposed king was imprisoned, first in one castle, then another, moved frequently to prevent rescue attempts. Johann crowned himself King Johann III. Erik remained imprisoned for the next 9 years. He was not executed immediately. Killing an anointed king, even a deposed one, was politically problematic. But Erik was never freed. He lived in captivity, his mind destroyed, his body wasting away. In 1577, he died in prison. The official cause was illness. Most historians believe he was poisoned on Johann's orders, eliminated quietly once he was no longer useful as a hostage or a threat. Johann III ruled for 24 years, from 1568 to 1592. His reign was marked by constant religious and political turmoil. Johann's wife, Katarina Jagiellonica, was a devout Catholic. Johann himself flirted with Catholicism, perhaps out of genuine belief, perhaps out of political calculation to strengthen ties with Poland and potentially reconcile with Rome. The Swedish nobility and clergy, newly Protestant and deeply suspicious of any Catholic influence, resisted fiercely. The Church of Sweden had become Lutheran under Gustav Vasa. Protestant ministers had been installed. Lutheran liturgy was standard. Any hint of Catholic restoration was seen as betrayal, as a return to the old order that Gustav Vasa had overthrown. Johann tried to walk a careful line. He proposed a new liturgy, the Red Book, that blended Lutheran and Catholic elements. It was rejected by the church and the nobility. He corresponded with the Pope about potential reconciliation. Those letters, when they became public, caused scandal. Johann's son Sigismund was raised Catholic. This was Katarina's doing. She insisted that her son be educated in the true faith. Sigismund was sent to Poland, where he was raised at the Polish court, immersed in Catholic culture, educated by Jesuits. When Johann died in 1592, Sigismund inherited the Swedish throne. He was already King of Poland, having been elected by the Polish nobility in 1587. Sigismund now ruled two kingdoms. The Swedish estates were horrified. A Catholic king, a king who lived in Poland and viewed Sweden as a secondary concern. A king educated by Jesuits who might try to re-Catholicize Sweden by force? Absolutely unacceptable. Enter Karl, the youngest of Gustav Vasa's sons, the one who had waited longest, the one who had watched his brothers rule and fail and scheme, the one who understood that patience and timing mattered more than bold action. Karl positioned himself as the defender of Swedish Protestantism, the guardian of the Reformation, the protector of Swedish sovereignty against foreign Catholic influence. He rallied the estates. He built alliances with the lower nobility, with the clergy, with merchants and burghers in the cities. He presented himself as the only man capable of saving Sweden from being absorbed into a Catholic Polish empire ruled from Krakow. Sigismund, still in Poland, understood the threat. In 1598, he sailed to Sweden with an army to assert his authority, to crush Karl's rebellion, to secure his Swedish throne. The two sides met at the Battle of Stangebro, near Linköping, in September of 1598. It was not a large battle by European standards, perhaps 5,000 men on each side, but it was decisive. Karl's forces were better organized, better motivated, fighting for what they believed was the survival of Swedish independence. Sigismund's army was a mixed force of Swedish loyalists and Polish mercenaries who were far from home and not particularly invested in the outcome. The battle lasted only a few hours. Karl's infantry held their ground. His cavalry smashed through Sigismund's flanks. The Polish mercenaries broke and ran. Sigismund's Swedish supporters surrendered or fled. Sigismund himself barely escaped. He fled to his ships and sailed back to Poland, leaving Sweden to Karl. The Catholic king had been defeated. The Protestant champion had won. But Karl did not stop there. He did not settle for military victory. He wanted total control, absolute authority, the elimination of anyone who might challenge him. He hunted down Sigismund's supporters. Swedish nobles who had sided with the Catholic king were arrested. Trials were held, mock trials, really, where the outcome was predetermined. In March of 1599, 5 leading Swedish nobles were beheaded in the main square of Linköping. Their heads were displayed on pikes. Their estates were confiscated. It became known as the Linköping bloodbath, a deliberate echo of the Stockholm bloodbath that had triggered Gustav Vasa's rebellion 80 years earlier. Karl was sending a message that loyalty to a foreign Catholic king was treason, that opposition to Karl would be met with death, that Sweden would be Protestant and independent, and anyone who disagreed could be buried. Karl purged the bureaucracy, the military, the church. He removed officials who had served Sigismund. He promoted men loyal to him. He created a network of supporters who owed their positions, their wealth, their futures to him. And then, in 1604, he crowned himself King Karl IX. Not King Karl III, which would have been the correct numbering based on previous Swedish kings named Karl. Karl IX. He inflated his numbering to suggest a longer, more legitimate lineage, to make the Vasa dynasty seem more ancient and established than it actually was. The Swedish nobility never forgave him. They saw him as a usurper, a murderer, a man who had overthrown the rightful king through violence and seized the throne for himself. Karl did not care. He had learned from his father that power is not about being loved or respected. It is about being obeyed. And if obedience requires fear, then fear it is. Karl IX ruled with an iron fist. He expanded Swedish territory through war with Denmark, Poland, and Russia. He built up the military. He centralized administration even further than his father had. He created the conditions for Sweden to become a regional power. But he also created enemies. Lots of them. King Sigismund III of Poland never forgave him for the theft of the Swedish throne. Sigismund remained king of Poland and spent the rest of his life, more than 40 years, trying to reclaim Sweden, launching wars, funding rebellions, refusing every peace offer that did not include his restoration to the Swedish throne. King Christian IV of Denmark resented Swedish expansion into territories Denmark considered its sphere of influence. The Baltic coast, the mouth of the Gotha River, control over trade routes. These were areas where Danish and Swedish interests collided, and Christian was not a man inclined to compromise. The Russian Tsars viewed Swedish encroachment into Ingria and Karelia as threats to Russian security and access to the Baltic. When Karl IX died in 1611, he left his 16-year-old son a kingdom at war on 3 fronts, a nobility that hated the Vasa dynasty and wanted to limit royal power, and a treasury drained by constant military campaigns. That son was Gustavus Adolphus. And the question facing him, the question that would define his entire reign, was brutally simple. Could he survive what his father had left him? Part 3. The Education of a Warrior King. Gustavus Adolphus was born on December 9, 1594, in Stockholm. He was the eldest surviving son of Karl IX and Christina of Holstein-Gottorp, a German princess who brought connections to Protestant networks across Northern Europe. From the moment of his birth, Gustavus Adolphus was treated not as a child, but as a future king. His education was designed to produce a ruler capable of defending Sweden in a hostile world, a commander capable of leading armies, a statesman capable of navigating the treacherous waters of European politics. Languages came first. By the time Gustavus Adolphus was 10 years old, he could speak Swedish, German, Dutch, and Latin fluently. He later added French, Italian, and some Polish and Russian. This was not academic dilettantism. Languages were tools. They allowed direct communication with foreign generals, diplomats, merchants, scholars. They eliminated the need for translators who might shade meanings or conceal truths. In a world where information was power, linguistic ability was a strategic asset. Military history was drilled into him relentlessly. He read Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, studying how Roman legions moved, how they fortified camps, how they used engineering to overcome obstacles. He read Vegetius's De Re Militari, the definitive Roman military manual, absorbing lessons about discipline, training, logistics. He studied contemporary accounts of battles, analyzing what worked and what failed, why certain tactics succeeded and others led to disaster. Physical training was constant. Gustavus Adolphus rode horses from age 5, learning not just how to sit a saddle, but how to control a mount during combat, how to fight from horseback, how to lead cavalry charges. He fenced, practiced with swords and pistols, trained until his hands were calloused and his muscles ached. He learned to endure discomfort, to function while exhausted, to push through pain. He was taught mathematics, essential for understanding artillery trajectories, siege engineering, logistics. He studied fortification design, how to build bastions, how to position cannon, how to create killing zones. He learned map reading, how to assess terrain, how to identify choke points and defensible positions. But perhaps most importantly, Gustavus Adolphus was taught through observation and participation. His father, Karl IX, took him on military campaigns from age 11. Gustavus Adolphus was not coddled or kept safe in the rear. He was brought to the front lines, exposed to the chaos and violence of war, forced to watch men die, to see what musket balls did to flesh, to smell blood and gunpowder and fear. At 13, Gustavus Adolphus participated in his first siege, the Siege of Kalmar during the Kalmar War against Denmark. He watched engineers dig trenches, position artillery, calculate angles of fire. He saw how sieges were slow, brutal affairs where disease and starvation killed as many as cannon fire. At 15, he commanded a small force in a skirmish near the Russian frontier. It was a minor action, barely worth mentioning in most histories. But for Gustavus Adolphus, it was formative. He learned that theoretical knowledge meant nothing if you could not execute under pressure, if you froze when men were screaming and dying around you. When Karl IX died in 1611 and Gustavus Adolphus inherited the throne at 16, he was not an ordinary teenager. He was a weapon that had been forged over 16 years of intensive preparation. He had been educated, trained, hardened, and tested. He had been raised to believe that kings who hesitated died, that weakness invited destruction, that the only security came from strength and the will to use it. But he was also still 16, still physically young, though tall and strong, still emotionally developing, learning to control impulses, manage anger, project authority, still untested as an independent ruler, as the final decision-maker whose choices would determine whether Sweden survived or collapsed. The Swedish nobility saw his youth as an opportunity. They had hated Karl IX's authoritarianism, his centralization of power, his contempt for aristocratic privilege. Now, with a boy king on the throne, they could reclaim what they had lost. When the estates met to confirm Gustavus Adolphus as king, they imposed conditions. A regency council would rule until Gustavus Adolphus turned 18. The council, led by the chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, would control policy, finances, military appointments. Gustavus Adolphus could attend council meetings, could offer opinions, but he could not make unilateral decisions. The nobles believed they had neutered royal power. They believed they could control the young king, shape him into a figurehead, restore aristocratic dominance over Swedish politics. They catastrophically underestimated Gustavus Adolphus. Part 4. The Regency and the Forging of Power. The Regency Council, that governed Sweden from 1611 to 1614, believed they could control the young king. They were led by Axel Oxenstierna, a man who would become one of the most influential figures in Swedish history, a statesman whose political acumen and administrative genius would shape Sweden for decades. Oxenstierna was 48 years old when Karl IX died. He came from minor nobility, but he had risen through merit, through intelligence, through an almost preternatural ability to navigate political complexities. He was methodical where others were impulsive, cautious where others were rash, always thinking 3 moves ahead. He believed in institutions, in laws, in balanced governance, where royal power was checked by aristocratic council. He looked at 16-year-old Gustavus Adolphus and saw potential but also danger. The boy had his father's intensity, his grandfather's ambition. Left unchecked, he might become another tyrant, another Karl IX who trampled aristocratic rights and ruled through fear. The Regency, Oxenstierna believed, was an opportunity to train Gustavus Adolphus in the arts of compromise, consultation, and measured decision-making. Gustavus Adolphus played along. He attended council meetings, sat quietly, listened to debates. He asked questions that seemed naive, deferential. He appeared to accept the limitations placed on his authority. The councillors relaxed. They believed the boy was malleable, teachable, willing to work within the system they had created. They were watching a performance. Behind the mask of youthful deference, Gustavus Adolphus was studying them, learning their arguments, their alliances, their weaknesses. He was biding his time, waiting for the moment when he could act decisively. That moment came sooner than anyone expected, forced by external crisis rather than internal maneuvering. In 1611, Denmark had declared war on Sweden. The Danish king, Christian IV, commanded a small professional army and a powerful navy. The Swedes were distracted by events to their east, where Muscovy was suffering her time of troubles between 1604 and 1613, a period of political chaos, and Sweden had also been involved in a war with Poland since 1600. In the 1611 campaign, Christian was able to capture the city of Kalmar on the southeast coast of Sweden, with an army that contained on 4,580 infantry and 645 cavalry. The campaign of 1612 was dominated by inconclusive border warfare. The Danish navy had control of the sea, allowing Christian to capture Öland. And in June 1612, the Danes captured Elfsborg on the west coast of Sweden. The war with Denmark was going so terrible bad. Denmark had laid siege to the key strategical city of Kalmar, which opened the door for a great invasion and perhaps occupation of large parts of Sweden. King Christian IV of Denmark was 46 years old, ambitious, aggressive, and convinced that Swedish weakness under a boy king created an opportunity for Danish expansion. Christian wanted to reclaim territories lost in previous wars, to reassert Danish dominance over Scandinavia, to reduce Sweden to the subordinate position it had held under the Kalmar Union. They had professional soldiers, experienced commanders, superior artillery. The Swedish forces opposing them were scattered, poorly coordinated, still operating under the fragmented command structure of the Regency. The Danish advance was swift and brutal. Towns fell. Fortresses surrendered. Refugees fled north, bringing stories of Danish soldiers looting, burning, terrorizing civilian population. The Regency Council panicked. Oxenstierna advocated immediate peace negotiations. Sweden could not afford a prolonged war with Denmark. The treasury was strained by ongoing conflicts with Poland and Russia. The army was divided among three fronts. Better to accept territorial losses, pay an indemnity, secure peace, and rebuild strength for future confrontations. Gustavus Adolphus disagreed vehemently. Publicly, he argued in council meetings that accepting Danish demands would only invite further aggression, that weakness rewarded with concessions taught enemies that Sweden could be bullied. He argued that Swedish soldiers were dying while the council debated, that every day of delay gave Denmark time to consolidate gains and prepare for deeper advances. And then Gustavus Adolphus did something that shocked the council. He announced he was going to the front, not as an observer, as a commander. The councillors protested. The king was 17 years old. He had never commanded in a real war. He was too valuable to risk. If he was captured or killed, Sweden would be thrown into chaos. Gustavus Adolphus ignored them. He left Stockholm with a small bodyguard, rode south toward the fighting, and joined up with the Swedish defense forces and the remnants of the Kalmar garrisons. His arrival electrified the troops. Soldiers who had been demoralized, who had been considering surrender or desertion, suddenly found their courage. The king, a boy, yes, but their king, had come to fight alongside them. If he was willing to risk death, how could they refuse to fight? Gustavus Adolphus threw himself into the work as a commander with manic energy. He worked alongside soldiers repairing fortifications. He visited the wounded, spoke to them, remembered their names. He positioned artillery, calculated firing angles, adjusted tactics based on Danish movements. He slept 4 hours a night, ate the same rations as common soldiers, exposed himself to enemy fire with a recklessness that terrified his officers. The defense held, not because Gustavus Adolphus was a tactical genius, not yet, but because his presence transformed morale. The Danish invaders found themselves facing an enemy that refused to break, that kept fighting even when defeat seemed inevitable. He actively led campaigns to recover areas, including a successful operation to reconquer the island of Öland, which is adjacent to Kalmar. But the reconquering the island of Öland was not enough. Denmark controlled huge swaths of southern Sweden. The war was a disaster, and eventually, reality imposed itself. In 1613, Sweden signed the Treaty of Närad. It was a humiliating peace. Sweden had to pay Denmark 1 million riksdaler, an astronomical sum, to recover the fortress of Elfsborg, which was incredibly important since it controlled the important access to the North Sea, as well as a bastion from the Danish forces in Norway, given that Norway and Denmark was in a union at this time. Without that port, Swedish trade to the continent would be strangled. Sweden was forced to pay the ransom. They borrowed money from Dutch merchants, imposed emergency taxes, squeezed every possible resource from an already strained economy. Gustavus Adolphus attended the treaty signing. He said nothing, but inside, he was seething. This, he believed, was what happened when caution replaced boldness, when compromise replaced strength. Denmark had invaded. Sweden had fought bravely, and yet Sweden was paying Denmark for the privilege of recovering its own territory. He never forgot. Years later, when Sweden was strong and Denmark was vulnerable, Gustavus Adolphus would remember the Treaty of Närad. He would remember the humiliation, and he would extract payment with interest. But in 1613, he could do nothing but watch and learn. The lesson he learned was this: that the world respects only power, that peace secured through weakness is temporary, that the only guarantee of security is military strength, so overwhelming that enemies fear to attack. During the war, however, his actions and his demeanor convinced Chancellor Oxenstierna to declare Gustavus an adult at only 17. That's how Gustavus assumed full control and was declared of age in December 1611 or January 1612. He was permitted to take the throne early, despite the legal age of majority being 21 or 24, by agreeing to concessions with the Swedish estates and working closely with Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna. He assumed full control and was declared of age in December 1611 or January 1612. The regency ended. He assumed full royal authority, and immediately everything changed. Part 5. The young king takes control. Gustavus Adolphus's first act as sole ruler was to reorganize the military command structure. No longer would Swedish forces operate under divided command, with different generals answering to different councillors. All military authority would flow through the king. Commanders would be appointed by Gustavus Adolphus, answerable to Gustavus Adolphus, removable by Gustavus Adolphus. Oxenstierna protested. This was exactly the kind of centralization, the kind of personal rule, that the regency had been designed to prevent. Gustavus Adolphus listened to the protests, nodded politely, and implemented the changes anyway. He promoted officers based on competence, not birth. Men from minor nobility, even commoners who had demonstrated ability, found themselves elevated to command positions. This enraged the old aristocracy, who believed that military command was an aristocratic prerogative, that common-born officers were an affront to social order. Gustavus Adolphus did not care. He had spent years watching aristocratic commanders bungle campaigns, lose battles through incompetence, prioritize personal honor over tactical sense. He wanted officers who could fight, who could win, who understood that battles were won through discipline and tactics, not noble lineage. He reorganized the army itself. The old system, where nobles provided soldiers in exchange for land grants, was gradually phased out. Instead, Gustavus Adolphus implemented a national conscription system called the Indelningsverket, or the allotment system in English. Every Swedish province was divided into districts called rotar. Each rot, typically encompassing several farms, was required to provide, equip, and support one soldier. That soldier would serve for a fixed term, be trained to professional standards, and remain on call for military service. It was revolutionary. Other European armies relied on mercenaries, foreign soldiers who fought for pay and plunder, who switched sides if offered better terms, who had no loyalty beyond their own self-interest. Swedish soldiers would be native Swedes, fighting for their own country, motivated by patriotism as well as pay. It was also expensive and unpopular. Farmers resented having to support soldiers. Provincial authorities resented the administrative burden. The nobility resented losing their traditional military role. Gustavus Adolphus pushed it through anyway. He used the same methods his grandfather had used. He made it clear that resistance was futile, that opponents would be crushed, that Sweden's survival depended on military reform, and anyone who obstructed reform was betraying the nation. He also reformed military training. Swedish infantry began drilling constantly. They practiced loading and firing muskets until they could deliver volleys with mechanical precision. They practiced forming squares to repel cavalry charges. They practiced advancing under fire, maintaining formation even when men were falling around them. Discipline became paramount. Swedish soldiers who looted were hanged. Soldiers who raped civilians were executed. Soldiers who deserted were hunted down and shot. Gustavus Adolphus understood that an army's effectiveness depended not just on tactical skill, but on behavior. An army that terrorized civilian populations created enemies, burned bridges, destroyed the very territories it was supposed to control. An army that maintained discipline could win hearts as well as battles. But training and discipline meant nothing without experience. And Gustavus Adolphus was about to get plenty of that. Part 6. The Russian War, First Blood, and Hard Lessons. Sweden's war with Russia had been grinding on since 1610, a frontier conflict focused on control of territories around the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. The Russian state was in chaos, torn apart by the Time of Troubles, a catastrophic period of civil war, foreign invasion, famine, and dynastic collapse that had begun in 1598 with the death of Tsar Fyodor I. Russia in the early 17th century was a nightmare of violence and disorder. False pretenders claiming to be the murdered heir Dmitry appeared and disappeared. Polish armies occupied Moscow. Swedish forces held Novgorod. Cossack bands roamed freely, plundering, burning, answering to no authority. The Russian population, already devastated by famine that killed perhaps a third of all Russians, died by the tens of thousands. Sweden, under Karl IX, had taken advantage of Russian weakness to seize key fortresses and territories. Now, under Gustavus Adolphus, the question was whether Sweden could hold those gains or whether a stabilizing Russia would reclaim them by force. Gustavus Adolphus took personal command of Swedish forces in the east. He was 19 years old. This would be his first independent military campaign, his first opportunity to test everything he had learned, to prove that he could command, that he could win. The campaign was not glorious. It was brutal, exhausting, and frustrating. The terrain was horrific. Dense forests, impassable swamps, rivers that had to be forded under enemy fire. Roads were non-existent. Supplies had to be hauled through wilderness on wagons that constantly broke down or got stuck in mud. Soldiers fell sick with dysentery, typhus, fevers. More men died from disease than combat. The Russian defenders employed tactics that frustrated Swedish training and discipline. They refused to stand and fight in open battle. Instead, they used ambushes, hit-and-run raids, scorched earth. They burned villages and crops as they retreated, leaving nothing for Swedish forces to forage. They attacked supply trains, cutting Swedish forces off from reinforcements and provisions. Gustavus Adolphus learned that war was not the clean tactical puzzle described in military treatises. It was chaos. It was improvisation. It was making decisions with incomplete information while exhausted, while sick, while under pressure from subordinates who questioned every choice. He learned that logistics mattered more than tactics. An army without food was a mob. An army without ammunition was useless. An army without shelter in the Russian winter died. Keeping supply lines open, organizing foraging parties, establishing supply depots. These were not glamorous tasks, but they determined whether armies survived or collapsed. He learned to be ruthless. When Russian partisans attacked Swedish supply trains, Gustavus Adolphus ordered captured partisans executed and their bodies displayed as warnings. When local populations supported Russian forces, Swedish soldiers burned villages in retaliation. War, Gustavus Adolphus discovered, could not be waged humanely. Mercy was a luxury armies could not afford. But he also achieved results. Swedish forces pushed deeper into Russian territory. They besieged and captured key fortresses. They defeated Russian armies in several small but significant engagements. And Gustavus Adolphus learned how to command under fire, how to inspire soldiers, how to make tactical adjustments in real time. The war ended in 1617 with the Treaty of Stolbovo. Sweden kept the territories it had conquered, Ingria and Kexholm, securing Swedish control over the entire southern coast of the Gulf of Finland. Russia was cut off from the Baltic Sea, trapped behind Swedish territory, unable to access European trade routes without Swedish permission. It was a strategic triumph. Sweden had expanded its territory, secured its eastern frontier, and crippled a potential rival. And Gustavus Adolphus, at 23 years old, had proven he could win. But the Russian war had also shown him his limitations. He had made mistakes. He had misjudged enemy capabilities. He had underestimated the difficulties of campaigning in hostile terrain. He learned from those mistakes, filed them away, determined never to repeat them. And he knew that Russia was only one front. Poland remained hostile. Denmark remained resentful. And somewhere to the south, in the chaos of the Holy Roman Empire, a war was brewing that would dwarf everything Gustavus Adolphus had experienced so far. Part 6. The Polish Quagmire, an endless struggle. While Gustavus Adolphus fought in Russia, the war with Poland continued. This was the most intractable of Sweden's three inherited conflicts, and it was rooted not in territory or trade, but in legitimacy and religion. King Sigismund III of Poland still claimed the Swedish throne. He had never accepted his deposition in 1598. He never would. For Sigismund, this was not a political dispute that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. It was a matter of divine right, of sacred duty, of religious obligation. Sigismund believed he was the rightful king of Sweden by birth and by God's will. He believed that Karl IX had been a usurper, a heretic, a rebel against lawful authority. And he believed that Gustavus Adolphus, Karl's son, was ruling Sweden illegitimately, that the Swedish crown rightfully belonged to Sigismund and his heirs. More than that, Sigismund was a zealous Catholic. He viewed the Protestant Reformation as a catastrophe, a heresy that had torn Christendom apart. He believed that restoring Catholic rule to Sweden was not just politically desirable, but morally necessary, that Swedish souls were being damned by Protestant false teaching, that he had a religious duty to bring Sweden back into the Catholic fold. So Sigismund funded Swedish Catholic exiles. He supported Polish military campaigns into Swedish-held territories in Livonia and Estonia. He refused every peace offer that did not include his restoration to the Swedish throne. The war with Poland became a generational struggle, lasting decades, consuming resources, killing tens of thousands, and achieving nothing but mutual exhaustion. Gustavus Adolphus initially hoped to end the Polish War through military victory. If Sweden could defeat Poland decisively, could capture key Polish territories, could threaten Poland's security, then perhaps Sigismund would be forced to negotiate realistically. In 1621, Gustavus Adolphus led Swedish forces into Livonia, the contested Baltic territory that both Sweden and Poland claimed. Livonia was economically valuable. It controlled trade routes, had prosperous cities, generated customs revenue. More importantly, it was strategically critical. Whoever controlled Livonia controlled the eastern Baltic coast. The campaign began well. Swedish forces captured the fortress of Riga, the largest and most important city in Livonia, after a siege that lasted from August to September. Riga's fall was a major victory, giving Sweden control over a key port and trade hub. But holding Livonia proved harder than conquering it. Polish forces, reinforced by Lithuanian allies, counterattacked. The war devolved into a grinding, back-and-forth struggle. Swedish forces would capture territory, then lose it. Polish forces would besiege Swedish-held fortresses, then be driven off. Neither side had the strength to achieve a decisive breakthrough, and both sides committed atrocities. Swedish soldiers, frustrated by Polish resistance, burned villages and massacred civilians. Suspected of supporting Polish forces, Polish soldiers, fighting to reclaim what they viewed as Polish territory, slaughtered Swedish settlers and garrison troops. The civilian population of Livonia, caught between two warring powers, died by the thousands. Gustavus Adolphus hated the Polish War. He saw it as a waste, a pointless struggle that drained Swedish resources without achieving meaningful gains. But he also understood that abandoning Livonia, accepting Sigismund's terms, was politically impossible. The Swedish estates would never accept a peace that recognized Sigismund's claim to the Swedish throne. Gustavus Adolphus himself would never bow to a Catholic king who viewed him as an illegitimate heretic. So the war continued. Year after year, battle after battle, siege after siege. Young men died in muddy trenches and frozen forests. Families were destroyed. Provinces were devastated. And the two kings, Gustavus Adolphus and Sigismund, remained locked in a struggle neither could win and neither could abandon. By the mid-1620s, Gustavus Adolphus began to realize that the Polish War could not be resolved militarily. Poland was too large, too populous, too resilient to be conquered by Swedish arms. And Sweden was too small, too stretched, too exhausted to maintain offensive operations indefinitely. A different strategy was needed, and that strategy would emerge from events far to the south, in the chaos of the Holy Roman Empire, where a war was beginning that would consume Europe for 3 decades and give Gustavus Adolphus the opportunity he had been waiting for. Part 7. The 30 Years' War begins, defenestration and destiny. The 30 Years' War did not announce itself with trumpets and declarations. It began with a petty local dispute in Bohemia, a conflict over church closures and religious rights that escalated with shocking speed into a continental catastrophe. The year was 1618. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of hundreds of semi-independent territories, kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, free cities, all nominally subject to the emperor, but in practice, operating with substantial autonomy. The empire had been religiously divided since the Reformation. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had established the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, which basically means, whose realm, his religion. Each ruler could determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. Subjects who disagreed could either convert or leave. It was an unstable compromise. It held for 60 years, but tensions simmered constantly. Catholics resented Protestant gains. Protestants feared Catholic reconquest. Both sides armed, formed alliances, and waited for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. That spark came in Prague. Bohemia was a prosperous kingdom within the empire, with a proud tradition of independence and a predominantly Protestant population. When the childless Emperor Matthias designated his cousin Ferdinand of Styria as his successor, Bohemian Protestants panicked. Ferdinand was a hardline Catholic, educated by Jesuits, a man who believed that heresy was not just wrong, but evil. In his own territories in Styria, Ferdinand had already expelled Protestant pastors, closed Protestant churches, and forcibly re-Catholicized the population. If he became emperor, Bohemian Protestants feared he would do the same to Bohemia. Their fears were justified. Ferdinand's regents in Prague began closing Protestant churches, restricting Protestant worship, appointing Catholics to government positions. The Bohemian estates protested. The regents ignored them, claiming they acted under imperial authority. On May 23, 1618, a group of Protestant nobles stormed Prague Castle. They confronted Ferdinand's two regents, Jaroslav Boržita of Martinice and Vilém Slavata, along with their secretary, Philip Fabricius. The nobles accused them of violating Bohemian religious liberties, of serving a tyrant, of betraying the kingdom. The regents protested. They invoked imperial authority. The nobles did not care. They grabbed the regents, dragged them across the room, hoisted them up to a window, and threw them out. It was a 70-foot drop. The regents fell, tumbling through empty air, arms flailing, undoubtedly screaming. They landed in a pile of refuse and manure that had been dumped at the base of the castle wall. By some miracle, or perhaps just the cushioning effect of soft filth, they survived. Bruised, humiliated, covered in excrement, but alive. Catholics later claimed divine intervention had saved the emperor's loyal servants. Protestants joked that the only thing that saved them was shit. But the defenestration of Prague, as it became known, was no joke. It was a declaration of war. The Bohemian estates had physically assaulted imperial representatives, rejected imperial authority, and set in motion a chain of events that would devastate Europe. Ferdinand, crowned Holy Roman Emperor after Matthias's death in March 1619, responded with fury. Bohemia had rebelled. Heretics had assaulted his representatives. Order would be restored, authority reasserted, and rebels punished with exemplary severity. He sent an army. The Bohemian estates, realizing they had crossed a line from which there was no return, deposed Ferdinand as King of Bohemia and elected a replacement. Frederick V, Elector Palatine, a young, idealistic Calvinist prince, married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England. Frederick was earnest, pious, convinced that God had called him to defend Protestantism in Bohemia. He accepted the Bohemian crown, traveled to Prague, and prepared to defend his new kingdom against imperial forces. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Frederick believed that Protestant powers across Europe would rally to his support. England would send troops after all. Frederick was King James's son-in-law. The Dutch Republic would provide money and soldiers. German Protestant princes would form a defensive alliance. Together, they would stop Ferdinand's aggression and secure Protestant rights. None of it happened. England sent money but no troops. The Dutch were preoccupied with their ongoing war against Spain. German Protestant princes hesitated, afraid of provoking imperial retaliation. Frederick found himself isolated, ruling a kingdom that was about to be invaded by overwhelming force. In 1620, Ferdinand's army, reinforced by Spanish troops and Bavarian forces, under the command of Count Tilly, marched on Prague. The two armies met on November 8 at White Mountain, just outside the city. The Battle of White Mountain lasted 2 hours. It was a rout. The Bohemian army, hastily assembled, poorly trained, led by commanders who did not trust each other, collapsed almost immediately. Frederick's forces broke and ran. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Officers abandoned their posts. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. Frederick himself barely escaped. He fled Prague, then fled Bohemia, then fled the empire entirely, eventually finding refuge in the Netherlands. He had been king of Bohemia for one winter, earning him the mocking nickname the Winter King. Ferdinand's revenge was systematic and terrifying. He arrested Bohemian nobles who had supported the rebellion. He held trials, perfunctory affairs where guilt was predetermined, and sentences were death. On June 21, 1621, 27 Bohemian nobles, knights and burghers, were executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Some were beheaded. Others were hanged. Others were quartered, literally torn apart. Their heads were displayed on the Charles Bridge. Their estates were confiscated and redistributed to Catholic loyalists. Ferdinand then set about destroying Bohemian Protestantism. He expelled Protestant pastors, more than 30,000 people forced to leave their homes, their churches, their communities. He closed Protestant schools. He reconsecrated Protestant churches as Catholic. He imposed Catholicism as the only legal religion in Bohemia. Anyone who refused to convert faced imprisonment, exile, or death. Bohemia, which had been majority Protestant, was forcibly recatholicized within a decade. The Bohemian language and culture were suppressed. German became the language of administration. Czech national identity was crushed under Habsburg absolutism. But Ferdinand's victory terrified Protestant rulers across the empire. If the emperor could destroy Bohemian Protestantism so completely, what was stopping him from doing the same elsewhere? If imperial armies could march with impunity, imposing religious uniformity by force, where would it end? The war spread. Denmark intervened in 1625. King Christian IV, a Lutheran, led an army into northern Germany, posing as the defender of Protestantism while actually pursuing territorial expansion and control over lucrative Baltic trade routes. Christian was a capable king, but an overconfident general. He underestimated imperial military strength and overestimated Protestant unity. German Protestant princes, rather than rallying to Christian's banner, hedged their bets, unwilling to commit fully to either side. Ferdinand responded by hiring Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian nobleman who had enriched himself buying confiscated Protestant estates. Wallenstein offered to raise, equip, and command an army at his own expense. In exchange, he demanded total operational control and the right to support his army through contributions, systematic extortion of occupied territories. Ferdinand agreed. Within months, Wallenstein had raised an army of 50,000 men, one of the largest forces in Europe. Wallenstein and Tilly crushed the Danish invasion. They defeated Christian in several battles, pushed Danish forces back into Denmark, and forced Christian to sign the Treaty of Lübeck in 1629. Denmark withdrew from the war, abandoning German Protestants to their fate. By 1629, the Catholic forces seemed unstoppable. Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution, demanding that all lands secularized by Protestants since 1552 be returned to the Catholic Church. It was a legal, political, and religious earthquake. Protestant princes faced the loss of vast territories, enormous wealth, and political power, and they had no way to resist. The Protestant military cause in Germany was on the brink of total collapse. This was the moment Gustavus Adolphus had been waiting for. Part 8. The decision to intervene, strategy, fear, and opportunity. Gustavus Adolphus had been watching the 30 Years' War closely since it began. He read intelligence reports, spoke with Swedish diplomats posted in German courts, questioned merchants who traveled through war-torn territories. He understood that what was happening in the empire was not just another religious conflict. It was a fundamental struggle for control of Central Europe, with implications that reached far beyond Germany's borders. If Ferdinand crushed German Protestantism, if the Habsburgs consolidated control over the empire, if Catholic forces dominated the Baltic coast, Sweden's security would be threatened. Swedish trade routes would be vulnerable. Swedish alliances would be worthless. And eventually, the Catholic armies would come north. They would target Sweden itself, the last major Protestant power in Northern Europe. Gustavus Adolphus also saw opportunity. The German Protestant princes were desperate. They had been defeated, humiliated, abandoned by every ally they had counted on. They needed a savior, and a king who could position himself as that savior, who could lead a successful Protestant counteroffensive, could gain enormous prestige, enormous influence, and enormous power. But intervening was a gamble. Sweden was a small kingdom with a population of barely over 1 million. Its economy was modest compared to the great powers of Europe. Its army, though well-trained, was small, perhaps 30,000 men, and many of those were tied down in ongoing conflicts with Poland. If Gustavus Adolphus marched into Germany and failed, Sweden would be destroyed. The empire's forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Spanish armies, the most professional in Europe, could be called on for reinforcement. Wallenstein alone commanded 50,000 men. Gustavus Adolphus spent months calculating, planning, debating with his council. Oxenstierna was skeptical. The Chancellor argued that Sweden should focus on defending its own territories, that intervention in Germany was reckless overreach, that Sweden could not afford to fight the Holy Roman Empire. Gustavus Adolphus disagreed. He argued that defense was not enough, that sitting behind borders and hoping enemies would leave Sweden alone was naive, that security came only through asserting Swedish power abroad. He argued that the Protestant cause in Germany was on the brink of collapse, that if Sweden did not act now, there would be no opportunity later. He also needed justification, a cause that would rally domestic support, that would make Swedish intervention seem not like aggression, but like necessary defense. The Emperor provided it. Wallenstein's armies, flushed with victory over Denmark, moved north. They occupied the Baltic coast, seizing key ports in Pomerania and Mecklenburg. Imperial troops looted cities, brutalized populations, imposed contributions that bankrupted entire regions. Refugees fled to Swedish-controlled territories, bringing stories of atrocities. Villages burned, women raped, men executed for refusing to pay tribute. The imperial forces were not liberators or defenders of Catholicism. They were predators consuming everything in their path. Gustavus Adolphus presented these events to the Swedish estates in December 1629. He gave a speech that was carefully crafted, emotionally powerful, strategically brilliant. He spoke of the threat to Swedish security. Imperial forces on the Baltic coast were a dagger pointed at Sweden's heart. They controlled ports that Sweden needed for trade. They could blockade Swedish shipping. They could launch invasions into Swedish territory. He spoke of religious duty. Swedish Protestants had a moral obligation to defend their German brethren. Allowing the emperor to crush Protestantism in Germany was not just strategically foolish, it was spiritually wrong. He spoke of Swedish honor. Denmark had tried and failed. German Protestant princes had tried and failed. Sweden was the last hope. If Sweden did not act, the Protestant cause would die, and history would record that Sweden had stood by while Christendom burned. The estates were skeptical. War with the Holy Roman Empire? Against the most powerful military coalition in Europe? It was madness. Gustavus Adolphus pushed harder. He reminded the estates of the Treaty of Naird, of the humiliation Sweden had endured against Denmark. He reminded them that weakness invited aggression, that peace secured through cowardice was temporary. He reminded them that he had reformed the army, had won victories in Russia, had proven his ability to lead, and he made a promise. If the estates approved Swedish intervention, if they provided the funds and the soldiers, he would win. He would lead Swedish forces to victory. He would make Sweden a great power. He would ensure that no enemy ever again dared to threaten Swedish security. It was audacious, arrogant, possibly delusional. The estates approved. In July of 1630, Gustavus Adolphus sailed from Stockholm with 13,000 Swedish soldiers. He also brought a vision, a plan that was more sophisticated than simple military intervention. Gustavus Adolphus understood that defeating imperial armies was not enough. He needed to build a coalition, to create a Protestant alliance that could sustain itself, to establish Swedish influence in Germany that would last beyond his lifetime. He landed on the coast of Pomerania in July, stepping ashore onto German soil for the first time. Contemporary accounts describe him kneeling on the beach, scooping up sand, letting it run through his fingers, praying aloud for divine guidance and protection. Then he stood, drew his sword, and told his assembled soldiers that they were embarking on a great enterprise. They were not invaders or conquerors. They were liberators, defenders of the faith, instruments of God's will. The road ahead would be hard. Many would not return home. But those who survived, those who fought bravely, would be remembered as the men who saved Protestantism and made Sweden great. The soldiers cheered. The ships unloaded supplies, artillery, ammunition. And Gustavus Adolphus began his march inland, into the chaos, into the slaughter, into the heart of the 30 Years' War. Part 9. The first year, frustration, diplomacy, and slow progress. Gustavus Adolphus's first year in Germany was not glorious. It was frustrating, slow, and filled with diplomatic complications that threatened to derail the entire campaign before it truly began. The Protestant princes who had desperately needed Swedish help now hesitated to provide it. They feared that supporting Sweden would provoke imperial retaliation. They worried about Swedish ambitions. Was Gustavus Adolphus coming to liberate Germany or to conquer it? They doubted Swedish military capabilities. Denmark had tried to fight the empire and been crushed. Why would Sweden fare any better? Gustavus Adolphus found himself in a diplomatic nightmare. He needed allies, bases, supplies. He needed German princes to open their territories to Swedish forces, to provide food and shelter, to contribute troops to a Protestant coalition. But the princes were paralyzed by fear and suspicion. The Elector of Brandenburg, Georg Wilhelm, was particularly maddening. Brandenburg was strategically critical. It controlled territory in northern Germany that Swedish forces needed to pass through. Georg Wilhelm was Protestant, theoretically sympathetic to Swedish goals, but he was also cautious to the point of paralysis. Gustavus Adolphus met with Georg Wilhelm repeatedly. He negotiated, cajoled, threatened. He pointed out that neutrality was impossible, that Brandenburg would be devastated whether it supported Sweden or not, that the only question was whether Brandenburg would have any say in its own fate. Eventually, Brandenburg signed an alliance, but it was grudging, limited, hedged with conditions. Georg Wilhelm provided minimal support, always keeping one foot out the door, always ready to switch sides if imperial forces gained the upper hand. Saxony was even worse. The Elector of Saxony, Johann Georg, was a Lutheran, but also deeply conservative, more interested in preserving his own power than in defending Protestantism. He refused to commit to the Swedish cause, maintaining official neutrality while secretly negotiating with both sides. Gustavus Adolphus realized he was on his own. He could not rely on German princes to provide substantial military support. He would have to build his own coalition from scratch, win battles to prove Swedish strength, and force reluctant allies to join through demonstrated success rather than moral persuasion. So he focused on logistics. He secured Pomerania as a base, fortified key towns, established supply depots. He built a logistical network that could support sustained military operations, warehouses stocked with food and ammunition, hospitals for wounded soldiers, fortified camps protected by earthworks and artillery. He drilled his troops constantly. He wasn't just preparing for a fight, he was building a new kind of war machine. He was redesigning the very anatomy of battle. While the imperial army still relied on the tercio, massive, slow-moving squares of thousands of men, Gustavus broke his forces down. He created thinner, more flexible linear formations. This allowed more of his men to use their weapons at the same time, rather than having half the army stuck in the middle of a crowd, unable to see the enemy. He demanded a terrifying new level of Eldcraft, or firepower in English. He taught his musketmen the salvo. Instead of a staggered, constant trickle of fire, his ranks would all pull their triggers at once. A literal wall of lead designed to shatter an enemy's nerves as much as their bodies. And then, there were the guns. Gustavus knew that heavy siege cannons were useless in a fast-moving fight. So, he commissioned the regimental piece, a light, mobile cannon that could be pulled by a single horse or a few men. For the first time, the artillery didn't just sit on a hill. It galloped alongside the infantry, providing a mobile shield of fire that moved wherever the king needed it most. Swedish soldiers practiced loading and firing muskets, forming defensive squares, advancing under fire. Gustavus Adolphus personally supervised training, corrected mistakes, insisted on perfection. He knew that Swedish tactical superiority was his only advantage against numerically superior enemies, and he waited for an opportunity to engage imperial forces in battle. He needed a victory, a demonstration that Swedish arms could defeat the emperor's supposedly invincible armies. That opportunity came in May 1631, but not in the way Gustavus Adolphus hoped. Part 10. Magdeburg, the sack that shocked Europe. Magdeburg was one of the largest cities in northern Germany, a prosperous Protestant stronghold, with a population of around 30,000. It was also strategically critical, controlling the Elbe River and serving as a major trade hub. In May 1631, imperial forces under Count Tilly laid siege to Magdeburg. Tilly wanted the city as a base to strike at Swedish supply lines and to crush one of the last major Protestant centers in northern Germany. Gustavus Adolphus tried to relieve Magdeburg. He marched his army south, pushing hard, trying to reach the city before it fell. But geography, logistics, and the continued obstruction of supposed Protestant allies slowed him. Brandenburg refused to allow Swedish troops to pass through its territory without lengthy negotiations. Saxony delayed sending promised reinforcements. Gustavus Adolphus found himself marching in circles, unable to get to Magdeburg in time. On May 20, 1631, Tilly's forces stormed the city. What followed was one of the worst atrocities of the 30 Years' War. A massacre so horrific that it shocked even contemporaries who had grown accustomed to wartime brutality. Imperial soldiers poured through breached walls and opened gates. They killed indiscriminately. Men were cut down in the streets. Women were raped, then murdered. Children were trampled or thrown into fires. Soldiers looted everything of value: gold, silver, furniture, clothing, food. Then the fires started. Whether set deliberately by soldiers or accidentally during the chaos remains debated. What is certain is that fires spread rapidly through Magdeburg's densely packed wooden buildings. Within hours, most of the city was ablaze. People trapped in burning buildings screamed as they burned alive. Others who tried to flee were cut down by soldiers or driven back into the flames. The Elbe River filled with bodies, people who had thrown themselves in trying to escape the fires and drowned. By the time the fires burned out, Magdeburg was gone. A city of 30,000 reduced to ash, rubble, and corpses. Survivors numbered perhaps 5,000. Most of them women who had been kept alive to be raped repeatedly by soldiers. Count Tilly claimed he could not control his troops, that the fire started accidentally, that the slaughter was regrettable but inevitable given the city's resistance. No one believed him. Magdeburg became a byword for atrocity, for what happened when armies were unleashed without restraint, for the depths of depravity that war could reach. When Gustavus Adolphus arrived a few days later, he stood outside the ruins and stared at the destruction. Swedish officers expected him to weep, to rage, to express horror. He did not. His face was stone. He turned to his officers and said coldly that this was what happened when hesitation replaced action, when allies delayed and enemies advanced, when good men did nothing while evil triumphed. He used Magdeburg. He exploited it ruthlessly. He told the Protestant princes that this was their future if they continued to appease the emperor. He told his soldiers that they were not just fighting for territory, but to prevent more Magdeburgs, to stop a Catholic army that massacred civilians and burned cities. Magdeburg became a rallying cry. Gustavus Adolphus invoked it in speeches, in diplomatic correspondence, in negotiations. He turned a catastrophe into a weapon, using the horror to galvanize support, to overcome the fear and hesitation that had paralyzed Protestant resistance. But anger wasn't enough. To beat Tilly, Gustavus would have to prove that his new model army worked. He had spent months perfecting combined arms tactics, the idea that infantry, cavalry, and artillery were not separate entities, but limbs of the same body. His cavalry were no longer allowed to play the caracal, riding up, firing pistols, and retreating. Gustavus ordered them to charge at a full gallop with cold steel. They were to be the hammer, while his mobile cannons and disciplined musket lines were the anvil. It was a high-stakes gamble on speed and coordination over brute size. And then he marched south to confront Tilly directly. Part 11. Breitenfeld. The battle that changed everything. The two armies met on September 17, 1631, near the village of Breitenfeld, just north of Leipzig. As the morning mist cleared at Breitenfeld, the two eras of war stood face to face. On one side, Count Tilly and the Imperialists, solid, traditional, and seemingly immovable in their massive, deep formations. On the other, Gustavus and his Swedes, spread out in their thin, strange lines. The imperial officers laughed at the Swedish formation, calling them slender ribbons. They believed their heavy masses would simply roll over the thin Swedish lines by sheer weight. They didn't realize that those ribbons were designed to bend without breaking, and that every single man in that line was a cog in a machine that could fire, reload, and reposition faster than anything the world had ever seen. Tilly commanded approximately 35,000 men, a mix of Imperial and Catholic League forces. They were veterans, hardened by years of campaigning, confident in their superiority. Tilly himself was 72 years old, one of the most experienced commanders in Europe, a man who had fought in dozens of battles and never been decisively defeated. Gustavus Adolphus had about 23,000 Swedish troops and 18,000 Saxons. On paper, the forces were roughly equal. In reality, the Swedish-Saxon coalition was fragile. The Saxons were poorly trained, poorly led, and terrified of Tilly's reputation. Their commander, Elector Johann Georg of Saxony, was a political leader, not a military one. He had brought his army reluctantly, pressured by Gustavus Adolphus's success, and fearful of being left isolated. Tilly deployed his forces in the traditional manner. His infantry formed massive tercios, dense squares of pikemen surrounded by musketeers. These formations were 30 to 40 ranks deep, virtually impossible to break through frontal assault. His artillery was positioned in the center. His cavalry was divided between the flanks, ready to sweep around and attack enemy forces from behind. It was a formation that had dominated European battlefields for decades. It was powerful, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable. Gustavus Adolphus deployed differently. His infantry was arranged in thinner lines, only 6 ranks deep. This made Swedish formations more flexible, able to maneuver quickly, to wheel and turn in response to enemy movements. His artillery was mobile, light enough to be repositioned during battle. His cavalry was organized into smaller, more manageable units rather than single massive formations. The battle began around 2 in the afternoon. Tilly's artillery opened fire, bombarding Swedish positions. Gustavus Adolphus's artillery responded, and for an hour the two sides exchanged cannon fire. The cannonade that opened the battle was not just a noisy exchange. It was a massacre. While Tilly's guns were heavy and slow, the Swedish artillery, under the command of Lennart Torstensson, operated with a speed never before seen on a battlefield. The Swedish gunners were so well drilled they could fire 3 to 5 shots for every one Imperial volley. Tilly's dense tercios were massive, unmissable targets. As the iron balls skipped across the dry earth, they didn't just hit the front rank. They tore through dozens of men in the deep Imperial squares. The invincible tercios were bleeding before the first soldier had even moved. Then Tilly made his move. His cavalry on the Imperial right flank charged the Swedish left, hoping to collapse it and roll up the Swedish line from the side. The attack was powerful, coordinated, executed by professional cavalrymen who had crushed Danish and German Protestant forces in previous battles. But Gustavus Adolphus had anticipated this. His cavalry, composed of Swedish and Finnish horsemen who fought with disciplined ferocity, countercharged. The two forces collided in a chaos of swords, pistols, and trampling hooves. The Imperial cavalry under Pappenheim tried to break the king's own wing. 7 times they charged, using the old caracole tactic, riding up, firing pistols, and turning away. But the Swedes didn't wait for them to reload. The Finnish cavalry, the Hakkapeliita, screamed their battle cry, "Hakkapelle! Cut them down!" They didn't wheel away. They fired a single pistol shot at point-blank range, and then crashed into the Imperial horsemen at a full gallop with drawn swords. It was a revolution in shock tactics. The Imperial cavalry, the finest in the world, were physically knocked backward by the sheer momentum of the Swedish charge. Meanwhile, on the Swedish left flank, Imperial cavalry smashed into the Saxon forces. The Saxons, already nervous, broke almost immediately. Entire regiments fled the battlefield, abandoning their positions, throwing down weapons, running for their lives. Within minutes, the Swedish left flank was completely exposed, and Imperial cavalry poured through the gap. It should have been a disaster. Swedish forces were now flanked, outnumbered, and isolated. Tilly's tercios began advancing, confident that the battle was already won. With the Saxons fleeing, the entire left side of the Swedish army was gone. A mile-wide hole had opened, and Tilly's veterans were already turning to pour through it. In any other 17th century army, this would have been the end. But Gustavus had designed his army for this exact chaos. He ordered his second line, under Gustav Horn, to perform a maneuver called refusing the line. While under fire, the Swedish regiments didn't panic. They pivoted 90 degrees like a swinging door, creating a fresh wall of pikes and muskets where there had been nothing moments before. And then came the secret weapon. Hidden between the infantry regiments were the regimental 3-pounders. As the Imperial infantry closed in, thinking they were about to overrun a broken flank, these light cannons were suddenly wheeled forward. At point-blank range, they fired canister shot, shredding the Imperial front ranks like a giant shotgun. The Swedish infantry didn't just hold. They counterattacked into the smoke. Gustavus Adolphus rode along his lines, visible to every soldier, shouting orders, encouraging his men, personally directing artillery fire. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, always at the critical point, always where the fighting was hardest. Then the Swedish infantry advanced, not in a single massive push, but in coordinated waves. Musketeers fired disciplined volleys, pouring lead into the tercios at close range, then withdrew to reload while fresh ranks stepped forward. Pikemen covered their retreat, holding off any Imperial counterattack. The tercios began to buckle. They were designed to withstand frontal charges, cavalry attacks, traditional infantry assaults. They were not designed to withstand sustained, accurate artillery fire combined with disciplined musketry from flexible, mobile formations. The Swedish cavalry, having repelled the initial Imperial attack, swept around the flanks. They attacked the tercios from the sides, shooting into the dense formations, causing chaos and panic. By late afternoon, the tactical superiority was undeniable. The Swedish brigade system, shallow, flexible crosses of pikes and muskets, was outmaneuvering the lumbering tercios at every turn. The Swedes were firing in salvos, 3 ranks deep, unleashing a coordinated wall of lead that the Imperial veterans couldn't match. As the Swedish cavalry circled around and captured Tilly's own heavy guns, the Imperial army found itself trapped in a lethal crossfire. The very formations that had dominated Europe for a century were now nothing more than giant, immobile targets. The age of the tercio ended that day at Breitenfeld, crushed by the birth of modern combined arms. The Imperial army was disintegrating. Soldiers broke ranks and fled. Officers tried to rally them, to maintain cohesion, but discipline collapsed. Tilly himself was wounded, a musket ball striking his chest, and he barely escaped the field. The Swedish army pursued relentlessly. They cut down fleeing soldiers, captured artillery pieces, seized supply wagons. By nightfall, the Imperial army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were captured. Tilly's supposedly invincible tercios had been shattered. Breitenfeld was a revolution. For 12 years, the Imperial forces had seemed unstoppable. They had crushed Bohemia, destroyed Denmark, terrorized Germany. And now, in a single afternoon, a Swedish king with a smaller army had annihilated them. News of the battle spread across Europe like wildfire. Protestant princes who had been cowering suddenly found their courage. Alliances were offered. Support materialized. Cities opened their gates to Swedish forces. Money, supplies, and troops poured in from across Protestant Europe. Gustavus Adolphus became an overnight legend, the Lion from the North, the Protestant champion, the military genius who had done what no one else could, defeat the emperor's armies in open battle. But Gustavus Adolphus understood that one battle, however decisive, did not win wars. Breitenfeld had opened Germany to Swedish power. Now he had to exploit that opening, had to move quickly before the emperor could recover, before the moment passed. He marched south, deeper into Germany, toward the heartland of the empire. Part 12. The March Through Germany, Liberation and Occupation. After Breitenfeld, Germany lay before Gustavus Adolphus like a chessboard, where half the pieces had been swept away. The imperial forces were shattered, demoralized, scattered across hundreds of miles. Protestant princes who had refused to support Sweden now scrambled to declare their allegiance. Cities that had closed their gates to Swedish diplomats now flung them open to Swedish armies. Gustavus Adolphus moved south through Thuringia and Franconia with methodical speed. This was not a wild chase or a reckless pursuit. It was a calculated campaign designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: destroy remaining imperial forces, secure strategic territory, build a coalition of German Protestant states under Swedish leadership, and establish the logistical infrastructure needed to sustain long-term military operations. The Swedish army that marched through central Germany in late 1631 and early 1632 was a formidable instrument of war. It numbered around 40,000 men by this point, the original Swedish force supplemented by German Protestant recruits, Scottish and English mercenaries, Finnish auxiliary troops. They moved with discipline that amazed German observers. Swedish soldiers marched in formation, maintained order, refrained from the casual looting and violence that characterized other armies. This discipline was not accidental. Gustavus Adolphus enforced it with draconian severity. He issued orders that Swedish soldiers caught looting would be hanged. Soldiers who raped civilians would be executed. Officers who failed to control their men would be cashiered and disgraced. And he meant it. Throughout the campaign, Swedish soldiers were hanged for violations of military discipline, their bodies left dangling from trees as warnings. The discipline served multiple purposes. First, it maintained military effectiveness. An army that spent its time looting was an army that was not fighting, that was vulnerable to counterattack, that dissolved into an uncontrollable mob. Second, it won hearts and minds. German Protestant populations, who had been terrorized by Imperial and Catholic League armies, saw Swedish troops as liberators, not as yet another plague of armed predators. Cities welcomed Swedish forces because Swedish forces paid for supplies rather than stealing them, because Swedish soldiers could be controlled, because Gustavus Adolphus offered protection rather than exploitation. But discipline had limits. Armies had to eat. Soldiers had to be paid. And Sweden's treasury, never particularly full, could not support a 40,000-man army operating hundreds of miles from home. So Gustavus Adolphus implemented a system of contributions, mandatory payments from German territories under Swedish control. Cities paid monthly sums. Provinces provided food, fodder, clothing. The wealthy were assessed special taxes. It was extortion, dressed in legal language. But it was systematic extortion, organized extortion, extortion that came with receipts and accounting and the promise that territories that paid would be protected. It was preferable to the alternative, uncontrolled looting that destroyed economies and turned populations into enemies. Gustavus Adolphus also reorganized the political structure of Protestant Germany. He created the Heilbronn League in 1633, a confederation of Protestant states under Swedish leadership. Member states contributed troops and money to the common defense. In exchange, they received Swedish military protection and a voice in strategic decisions. The Heilbronn League was brilliant politics. It gave Gustavus Adolphus control over German Protestant resources, while maintaining the fiction that Sweden was fighting for German liberty rather than Swedish conquest. It created a framework that could outlast individual battles, that could survive even if Gustavus Adolphus himself fell. As Swedish forces pushed south, they liberated city after city. Würzburg fell in October 1631. Frankfurt opened its gates in November. Mainz, one of the most important cities on the Rhine, surrendered in December. Each conquest brought strategic advantages. Mainz controlled the Middle Rhine, a critical transportation route. Frankfurt was a major commercial hub. Würzburg was the seat of a powerful Catholic bishop whose territories could be redistributed to Protestant allies. But conquest also brought complications. Each occupied city required a garrison. Each territory needed administrators. Each alliance demanded diplomatic attention. Gustavus Adolphus found himself not just commanding an army, but governing a sprawling network of occupied territories, managing alliances with dozens of German princes, adjudicating disputes, distributing resources. He worked 18-hour days. He woke before dawn, met with commanders, reviewed intelligence reports, dictated correspondence to secretaries. He inspected fortifications, visited wounded soldiers, attended Protestant church services, where pastors praised him as God's instrument. He negotiated treaties, threatened wavering allies, promised rewards to the loyal. And he planned. Always planning. Thinking 3 moves ahead, anticipating enemy responses, preparing contingencies. By spring 1632, Gustavus Adolphus controlled most of northern and central Germany. His armies occupied the Rhineland, Franconia, Swabia. Only Bavaria, the heart of Catholic power in southern Germany, remained unconquered. Bavaria was ruled by Duke Maximilian, one of the emperor's most powerful allies. Maximilian had financed much of the Catholic League's military operations. His general Tilly had been the hammer that crushed Protestant resistance until Brighton fell. Bavaria was wealthy, well-defended, and intensely Catholic. Gustavus Adolphus decided to strike at Bavaria directly, to break Catholic power at its source. Part 13. The Lech Crossing, Tactical Brilliance, and Tilly's End. In April 1632, Gustavus Adolphus marched south toward Bavaria. His objective was Munich, the Bavarian capital. Capturing Munich would be a devastating psychological blow to the Catholic cause, would potentially knock Bavaria out of the war, would give Sweden control over southern Germany. But between the Swedish army and Munich lay the Lech River, and on the far bank of the Lech stood Count Tilly with a rebuilt imperial army. Tilly had used the months since Brighton fell to gather reinforcements, to train new recruits, to restore some measure of cohesion to Catholic forces. He had perhaps 35,000 men, not as many as before Breitenfeld, but still a formidable force. And he had chosen his defensive position brilliantly. The Lech River was a natural barrier, wide and fast-flowing with spring snowmelt. Tilly positioned his forces on the southern bank, behind earthwork fortifications, with artillery covering every possible crossing point. He believed the position was impregnable. Any Swedish attempt to cross would result in a massacre. Soldiers caught in the river, exposed to artillery and musket fire, unable to form defensive positions. Gustavus Adolphus studied the situation. A frontal assault was suicide. Trying to cross under fire would cost thousands of Swedish lives and probably fail. He needed another approach. He found it upstream, several miles east of Tilly's main positions. There was a bend in the river where the current was slightly slower, where the banks were lower, where Swedish engineers believed they could construct a pontoon bridge quickly enough to get troops across before Tilly could react. Gustavus Adolphus ordered the operation to proceed under cover of darkness on April 14th. Swedish engineers worked through the night, building a floating bridge from boats, planks, and ropes. It was delicate, dangerous work. The river was swift, the water freezing cold. Several engineers drowned when boats capsized. But by dawn, the bridge was complete. The first Swedish troops crossed before Tilly realized what was happening. They secured a small bridgehead on the southern bank, began digging defensive positions, set up artillery to cover subsequent crossings. When Tilly learned of the Swedish crossing, he reacted immediately. He shifted troops from his main positions to attack the bridgehead, hoping to crush it before Swedish forces could reinforce. But Gustavus Adolphus had anticipated this. As Tilly's forces moved east to confront the bridgehead, they exposed their flank to Swedish artillery positioned on the northern bank. Swedish cannon opened fire, raking Tilly's columns as they marched. Tilly tried to storm the bridgehead anyway. Imperial infantry attacked in massive formations, hoping to overwhelm the Swedish defenders through sheer weight. But the Swedish troops in the bridgehead held. They fired disciplined volleys, repelling assault after assault. Swedish artillery from across the river provided devastating support, firing over the heads of their own troops into the attacking Imperial formations. During the battle, a Swedish cannonball struck Tilly directly. It hit his leg, shattering bone, tearing through flesh. Tilly fell from his horse, bleeding heavily. He was carried from the field by his officers, conscious but in agony. With Tilly wounded and command structure disrupted, the Imperial attack faltered. Swedish reinforcements poured across the pontoon bridge. By nightfall, Swedish forces held a substantial bridgehead. Tilly's defensive line on the Lech had been flanked and was now untenable. In this old image from 1632, we can see a tactical overview of the battle. This is the bridge constructed by Gustavus Adolphus. This is the bridgehead the Swedes secured. The map says it was big enough to room about 100 men with muskets, called the Half Moon. This is Tilly's main defensive positions. That was heavily reinforced, but Tilly's men never had time to finish it before the battle was lost. Here, Tilly positioned a defensive line of musketeers. It was also here that Tilly was when he was shot, and these are Tilly's heavy artillery that he positioned to try and shoot the bridge. The Swedes positioned their cannons all along the riverbanks. So basically, this is what happened. Tilly expected the Swedes to cross the river at a certain point, but Gustavus Adolphus managed to sneak around and build his bridge without detection, at least not right away. As we can see in this exceptionally professionally drawn tactical map, there was a hill and dense forest between where the bridge were constructed and where Tilly had set up his original defenses. To his credit, Tilly did start on new fortifications when he realized that the Swedes had built a new bridge. By the cover of his musketeers, Tilly's engineers tried frantically to finish new fortifications at the foot of the hill. But when Tilly was wounded and the battle was lost, Tilly's army routed before the fortifications was ever finished. The Imperial army withdrew south, carrying their wounded commander with them. Tilly was taken to Ingolstadt, where surgeons tried to save his leg. They could not. Infection set in, gangrene spreading through damaged tissue. Tilly suffered for weeks, the wound festering, his body failing. He died on April 30th, 1632. He was 73 years old, a soldier who had spent his entire adult life in military service, who had won dozens of battles, who had been one of the most feared commanders in Europe. And he died not in glorious combat, but from an infected wound, in a sickbed, in pain and defeat. With Tilly dead, and the Lech River crossing secured, Bavaria lay open. Gustavus Adolphus's army marched on Munich with nothing to stop them. Part 14. The occupation of Munich, triumph, and overreach. On May 17, 1632, Swedish forces entered Munich without resistance. Duke Maximilian had fled, taking the Bavarian court with him. The Bavarian army had scattered. The capital of Catholic Bavaria, the heart of the Catholic League, was now occupied by Protestant Swedish troops. It was Gustavus Adolphus's greatest triumph to date. In less than 2 years, he had transformed the strategic situation in Germany completely. He had defeated the empire's best generals. He had occupied vast territories. He had built a Protestant coalition. He had made Sweden the dominant military power in Central Europe. Gustavus Adolphus entered Munich on horseback, riding through streets lined with nervous citizens. He was 37 years old, at the absolute peak of his physical and mental powers. He wore plate armor polished to a brilliant shine. His blonde hair and beard were immaculately groomed. He looked every inch the warrior king, the Protestant champion, the Lion of the North. He attended a Protestant service in Munich's main church, which had been Catholic just days before. He prayed publicly, thanking God for Swedish victories, asking for continued divine favor. He distributed alms to the poor, demonstrating magnanimity in victory. But privately, Gustavus Adolphus was worried. He understood that he had stretched Swedish power dangerously thin. His army was deep in southern Germany, hundreds of miles from Swedish territory, dependent on long supply lines that could be cut at any moment. His German allies were unreliable, liable to switch sides if the military situation changed. His treasury was strained to the breaking point. And most worryingly, the emperor had found a new champion. Albrecht von Wallenstein had returned. Part 15. Wallenstein returns. The rivalry emerges. Wallenstein's recall in April 1632 came at the emperor's moment of greatest desperation. With Tilly dead, with Bavaria occupied, with Protestant forces seemingly unstoppable, Ferdinand needed someone who could challenge Gustavus Adolphus militarily and psychologically. Only Wallenstein had that capability. Wallenstein took his time accepting Ferdinand's desperate pleas. He negotiated from a position of strength, demanding concessions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He would have total operational command, no interference from the emperor, no oversight from imperial counselors, no restrictions from German princes. He would have the authority to raise as many troops as he wanted, to fund them however he chose, to make truces and alliances as he saw fit. He would be generalissimo, supreme commander, answerable to no one. Ferdinand agreed to everything. He had no choice. By summer 1632, Wallenstein had raised an army of nearly 60,000 men. He did it through methods that were ruthless and efficient. He offered high pay to attract experienced mercenaries. He promised plunder to motivate recruits. He used his personal wealth, vast estates accumulated through buying confiscated Protestant lands, to fund initial recruitment. And he used his reputation. Soldiers knew that Wallenstein won battles, that armies under Wallenstein's command got paid, that service with Wallenstein offered opportunities for enrichment and glory. Wallenstein moved north into Saxony, threatening Swedish supply lines and forcing Gustavus Adolphus to respond. This was deliberate strategy. Wallenstein had studied Swedish tactics, had analyzed Breitenfeld and the Lech crossing, had identified strengths and weaknesses in Gustavus Adolphus's approach. He understood that Swedish tactical superiority depended on discipline, mobility, and superior firepower. In open battle on favorable terrain, Swedish forces had decisive advantages. So Wallenstein refused to give Gustavus Adolphus open battle on favorable terrain. Instead, Wallenstein fought a campaign of maneuver and attrition. He occupied fortified positions, forcing Swedish forces to besiege him or bypass him. He raided Swedish supply convoys, cutting off food and ammunition. He used his larger army to force Gustavus Adolphus to divide Swedish forces to defend multiple fronts. He played for time, knowing that time favored the emperor. The longer the war continued, the more Swedish resources would be strained, the more German allies would waver, the more likely internal Swedish opposition to the war would grow. It was brilliant strategy, and it drove Gustavus Adolphus to distraction. The two commanders maneuvered around each other for months, neither able to force a decisive engagement. They were like two chess masters, each anticipating the other's moves, countering before attacks could develop. Gustavus Adolphus grew increasingly frustrated. He needed a decisive battle to maintain momentum, to justify the costs of the campaign to the Swedish estates, to demonstrate that Swedish power was not ephemeral. But Wallenstein would not give him one. Wallenstein, for his part, was content to wait. His army was growing as he recruited more troops. Gustavus Adolphus's army was slowly shrinking as men died from disease, wounds, and combat. Mathematically, time was on Wallenstein's side. But mathematics could not account for human psychology, for ego, for the pressure both men felt to engage, to prove themselves against the only opponent either considered a true equal. In November of 1632, the situation changed. Wallenstein detached part of his army under Count Pappenheim to deal with Swedish forces, threatening imperial territories to the west. This temporarily reduced Wallenstein's numerical advantage. Gustavus Adolphus saw his opportunity. Wallenstein's army was weakened. If Gustavus Adolphus struck now, before Pappenheim could return, before Wallenstein could recall his detached forces, Swedish forces might have a chance to defeat Wallenstein decisively. It was a gamble. Wallenstein still had around 25,000 troops. Swedish forces numbered about 19,000. The odds were not favorable, but they were better than they would be if Gustavus Adolphus waited for Wallenstein to reunite his army. Gustavus Adolphus decided to attack. The two armies converged near the town of Lutzen, southwest of Leipzig, in early November 1632. Part 16. Lutzen, the Fog of War, and the Death of a King. The night before the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus Adolphus barely slept. He spent hours with his commanders, reviewing plans, discussing contingencies, studying maps by candlelight. He knew this battle would be different from Breitenfeld. Wallenstein was not Tilly. Wallenstein understood Swedish tactics, had prepared countermeasures, would not make the mistakes that had doomed imperial forces before. Wallenstein had studied the Swedish way and built a trap to break it. Along the road to Leipzig, he had his men dig deep, reinforced skirmisher trenches, an early form of trench warfare. He lined these ditches with his best musketeers, creating a lethal kill zone. He knew Gustavus relied on momentum, so he turned the battlefield into an obstacle course of mud and earthworks. He also abandoned the massive, slow tercios of the past, adopting smaller, more flexible units to mirror the Swedish lines. At Lutzen, Gustavus wasn't fighting the past. He was fighting a reflection of his own genius. Gustavus Adolphus also knew, though he never said it aloud, that this might be his last battle. He was 37 years old, had been fighting almost continuously for 2 decades, had exposed himself to enemy fire dozens of times. Statistically, his luck had to run out eventually. Commanders who led from the front, who positioned themselves at critical points in battles, who refused to hide behind their soldiers, those commanders died. But Gustavus Adolphus could not change who he was. He could not command from safety while his soldiers fought and died. It was not in his nature. More than that, it was not tactically sound. Swedish soldiers fought with fanatical courage because they believed their king shared their danger. Remove that belief, and Swedish tactical advantages would evaporate. So on the morning of November 6th, 1632, Gustavus Adolphus put on his armor. He wore 2 guns, one on each hip. His right side was painted red. He mounted his horse, the chestnut brown stallion, Strife, and prepared to lead his army into battle one more time. The day dawned cold and foggy. A thick mist rolled across the battlefield, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Soldiers could barely see their own comrades, much less the enemy. Officers shouted orders that were muffled and distorted by the fog. Gustavus Adolphus wanted to wait for the fog to lift. Fighting blind was dangerous, could lead to confusion, friendly fire, units getting separated, and destroyed piecemeal. But as morning turned to midday and the fog showed no signs of clearing, Gustavus Adolphus made the decision to attack anyway. He could not afford to wait another day. Pappenheim's detached forces were returning. Every hour of delay increased Wallenstein's strength. The Swedish army advanced through the fog, drums beating a steady rhythm, officers shouting to maintain formation. Artillery opened fire blindly, aiming at where commanders believed enemy positions should be. The thunder of cannon echoed across the field, mingling with the crack of musket fire and the shouts of men. Swedish infantry collided with Imperial positions. Fighting erupted all along the line. Brutal, close-quarters combat, where soldiers stabbed and shot at shapes emerging from the mist. There was no grand strategy, no coordinated maneuvers, just chaos and violence. Gustavus Adolphus rode with the Swedish right flank cavalry. This was where he believed the battle would be decided, where Swedish horsemen would need to break through Imperial positions to flank Wallenstein's main force. He positioned himself at the front, visible despite the fog, identifiable by his ornate armor and the blue and yellow Swedish colors. The fighting centered on the 7 windmills, a high ridge where Wallenstein had placed his heavy batteries. The Swedish Yellow Brigade, the king's elite, charged into the fog, trying to seize the guns. Here, the linear tactics that worked so well at Breitenfeld became a curse. In the blinding mist, the thin Swedish lines couldn't see the Imperial counterattacks until they were only paces away. The Yellow Brigade, the pride of the Swedish army, was caught in a crossfire so intense that nearly 2/3 of the unit fell in the first hour. The Swedish machine was grinding gears in the mud, losing its greatest asset, its coordination. Imperial cavalry formed to meet the Swedish charge. The two forces clashed in a swirl of horses, swords, and gunfire. Men fought hand to hand, grabbing at each other, stabbing with swords, firing pistols at point-blank range. In the chaos, Gustavus Adolphus became separated from his main bodyguard. He rode forward, perhaps trying to rally troops, perhaps pursuing fleeing enemies. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. What is certain is that a group of Imperial cavalrymen saw a Swedish officer riding alone, identified him as a high-value target even if they didn't recognize him as the king, and opened fire. Multiple musket balls struck Gustavus Adolphus. One hit his left arm, shattering bone. Another struck his back. His horse, wounded and panicked, bolted across the battlefield, dragging Gustavus Adolphus through enemy positions. More shots. One struck Gustavus Adolphus in the head, just above his left eye. He fell from the saddle, landing heavily on the ground. Imperial soldiers swarmed over him. They stripped his armor, took his weapons, emptied his pockets. They did not know they had just killed the King of Sweden, one of the most powerful men in Europe, the Protestant champion whose name terrified Catholic forces across the continent. They just knew they had killed an enemy officer and could loot his body. When Gustavus rode into the mist on the right wing, he wasn't just leading a charge, he was trying to fix a tactical collapse. His cavalry had become entangled in the hollow ways. The sunken roads Wallenstein had utilized as natural defenses. Because Gustavus had decentralized his command structure to allow for flexibility, his absence created a lethal silence. Without the king to synchronize the combined arms of the right wing, the Swedish cavalry and the supporting musketeers began to drift apart. In that gap, the Imperial cuirassiers, heavy, armored riders, found the king. The man who had spent his life perfecting military synchronization died in a moment of total, isolated chaos. When the fog finally lifted in early afternoon, Swedish cavalry found the body. It was naked, trampled, covered in blood and mud. The face was damaged, making immediate identification difficult. But officers recognized scars, physical features. They realized, with horror, that their king was dead. News spread through the Swedish ranks like a shockwave. Men who had been fighting with fierce determination suddenly wavered. Some began to retreat, believing the battle was lost, that without Gustavus Adolphus, there was no point in continuing. But Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar, one of Gustavus Adolphus's most capable subordinate commanders, took control. He was 23 years old, a German Protestant prince, who had joined Swedish service and learned warfare under Gustavus Adolphus's personal tutelage. Bernhard rode through Swedish lines, shouting that the king's death meant nothing if they lost the battle, that Gustavus Adolphus would not want them to mourn, but to fight, that the best way to honor their fallen king was to win. It worked. Swedish fury replaced Swedish grief. Soldiers who had been ready to flee instead launched renewed attacks. Swedish infantry advanced with their muskets firing in devastating volleys. Swedish cavalry charged again and again, breaking through Imperial line. The Swedish response wasn't just fury, it was a technical onslaught. Under the direction of Lennart Torstensson, the Swedish artillery performed a feat of near impossible logistics. Despite the mud and the carnage, they dragged the regimental three-pounders through the gore of the front lines. They positioned the guns so close to the Imperial trenches that they were firing canister shot. Thousands of iron musket balls, directly into the Imperial infantry at point-blank range. It was no longer a battle. It was a meat grinder. The Swedes used their superior rate of fire to simply delete the Imperial center, clearing a path through a wall of lead with a wall of iron. Wallenstein, who had been wounded in the foot early in the battle and could barely sit his horse, watched his forces crumble. He had held the field for hours, had believed victory was within reach. But the death of Gustavus Adolphus, rather than breaking Swedish resistance, had transformed it into something primal and unstoppable. By late afternoon, Wallenstein ordered a retreat. His forces pulled back, abandoning positions, leaving behind artillery and supply wagons. Swedish forces were too exhausted to pursue effectively, but they held the battlefield. Technically, the Swedes had won the Battle of Lutzen. They controlled the field. Imperial forces had withdrawn. By the traditional rules of warfare, victory belonged to Sweden. But Gustavus Adolphus was dead. And that changed everything. Lutzen proved that the Swedish system could survive even without its creator. The combined arms doctrine was so deeply ingrained in the officer corps that they could win a battle through sheer mechanical efficiency. But as the sun set over the bloody fields, the strategic reality set in. Wallenstein had retreated, yes, but he had killed the Swedish lion. Sweden had the tactics, they had the guns, and they had the field. But they had lost the only man who could turn those tactical victories into a lasting European peace. Part 17. Aftermath. A Kingdom in Shock. News of Gustavus Adolphus's death reached Stockholm in late November 1632. The reaction was shock, grief, and existential terror. The king who had transformed Sweden from a minor northern kingdom into a major European power, who had defeated the empire's best generals, who had made Swedish arms feared across the continent, was gone, and he left behind a 6-year-old daughter. Christina was Gustavus Adolphus's only surviving child. She had been born in December 1626, a daughter when everyone had hoped for a son. Gustavus Adolphus had loved her fiercely, had spent what little time he had between campaigns teaching her, playing with her, preparing her as best he could for a role no one wanted her to fill. Now, she was Queen of Sweden, a child queen who would not reach her majority for 12 years, who would require a regency to govern in her name, who represented both continuity and catastrophic vulnerability. The Regency Council, led by Axel Oxenstierna, took control immediately. Oxenstierna was now 69 years old, exhausted, grieving the loss of a king he had served for decades, facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything Gustavus Adolphus had built. The immediate question was whether to continue the war in Germany. Swedish forces still occupied vast territories. Swedish allies still looked to Sweden for leadership and protection. But without Gustavus Adolphus's personal leadership, without his tactical genius and charismatic command, could Sweden sustain the war effort? Oxenstierna decided to continue. Not out of enthusiasm, but necessity. Sweden had invested too much, too many soldiers, too much money, too much political capital, to simply withdraw. Abandoning Germany now would be seen as defeat, would encourage enemies, would betray Protestant allies who had committed to the Swedish cause. More pragmatically, Swedish forces in Germany were supported by contributions from occupied territories. Withdrawing would require transporting and supporting tens of thousands of soldiers on Swedish resources alone, which the treasury could not afford. So the war continued. But it changed fundamentally. Without Gustavus Adolphus, Swedish strategy became more defensive, more cautious. Swedish commanders were competent, but not brilliant. They could hold territory, could win tactical victories, but they could not replicate Gustavus Adolphus's ability to reshape entire campaigns through bold strategic choices. The war also became more brutal. Gustavus Adolphus's personal discipline, his insistence on controlling Swedish forces, his ability to punish atrocities swiftly, all of that died with him. Swedish commanders in Germany, under less direct oversight, allowed more looting, more violence against civilians, The army that had been liberators began to look more like occupiers. German Protestant princes, who had allied with Sweden out of belief in Gustavus Adolphus's leadership, began to waver. They saw Swedish forces extracting contributions, quartering troops, demanding resources. Without the personal charisma and military genius of Gustavus Adolphus to justify Swedish demands, the relationship between Sweden and its German allies became increasingly transactional and resentful. Part 18. Wallenstein's Fall, Paranoia and Assassination. Wallenstein, too, was exhausted after Lutzen. He had fought Gustavus Adolphus to a draw, but at enormous cost. His army was battered. His foot wound, though not life-threatening, caused him constant pain and limited his mobility. And he faced increasing pressure from Emperor Ferdinand to resume offensive operations. Wallenstein refused. He claimed his army needed time to rest, to recruit replacements, to resupply. He withdrew to winter quarters in Bohemia and made it clear he would not campaign until he judged his forces ready. But Wallenstein was also negotiating. Secretly, through intermediaries, with Swedish diplomats, with French agents, with Protestant princes. The content of these negotiations remained somewhat murky. Wallenstein covered his tracks well, used oral messages rather than written correspondence whenever possible, employed multiple layers of deniability. What seems clear is that Wallenstein was exploring the possibility of a separate peace, a settlement that would end the war and allow him to consolidate power in Bohemia as an independent or semi-independent ruler. Whether he intended to betray Ferdinand completely, to switch sides and join the Protestants, or simply to extract himself from a war he no longer believed could be won, historians still debate. Ferdinand learned of Wallenstein's negotiations. The emperor was furious. Wallenstein was supposed to serve imperial interests, not pursue his own agenda. Ferdinand had tolerated Wallenstein's arrogance, his demands for absolute authority, his accumulation of personal power, because Wallenstein delivered results. But negotiating with the enemy? Exploring peace terms without imperial authorization? That was treason. In February 1634, Ferdinand issued a secret order. Wallenstein was to be arrested, tried for treason, and if convicted, executed. If arrest proved impossible, he was to be killed. Wallenstein learned of the plot, probably through informants at the imperial court, possibly through intercepted messages. He tried to flee, to gather his loyalists, to escape to Swedish-controlled territory where he might negotiate protection in exchange for intelligence or military service. He moved too slowly. On February 25, 1634, a group of imperial officers, acting on Ferdinand's orders, cornered Wallenstein in the town of Eger, where he had stopped for the night. They broke into his quarters. Wallenstein was not wearing armor, was not armed. He tried to negotiate, to talk his way out, to invoke his position and authority. The officers ignored him. They had their orders. They attacked with swords and pikes, stabbing him repeatedly. Wallenstein died quickly, though not instantly. He bled out on the floor of his room, alone, except for the men killing him. His body was displayed briefly as proof of death, then buried without ceremony. His vast estates were confiscated by the emperor. His family was dispossessed. His name became synonymous with ambition that overreached, with a military genius who grew too powerful and was destroyed by the master he had served. Wallenstein's death removed the last great commander of the 30 Years' War's early phase. What remained were competent generals but not strategic geniuses. Experienced officers, but not men who could reshape campaigns through force of will and tactical brilliance. The war continued for another 14 years after Wallenstein's death. It became a grinding, attritional nightmare. A conflict that had lost all sense of purpose and continued simply because no one knew how to stop it, because too many people had invested too much to accept anything less than total victory, because the mechanisms of war had acquired their own momentum. Part 19. The geopolitical chessboard. France enters and Europe burns. By 1635, the 30 Years' War had fundamentally transformed. What had begun as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics had become a great power struggle for control of Central Europe. France, under Cardinal Richelieu's guidance, made the decisive choice to intervene directly. France was Catholic, but Richelieu was a pragmatist who placed French national interests above religious solidarity. He had watched Habsburg power grow, watched Spanish and Austrian forces coordinate operations, watched the empire consolidate control over German territories. He understood that a Habsburg-dominated Europe was an existential threat to France, regardless of religion. So France allied with Protestant Sweden, with Protestant Dutch rebels, with anyone who would fight the Habsburgs. French money funded Swedish operations in Germany. French troops fought alongside Protestant forces. Cardinal Richelieu, a Catholic prince of the Church, became the paymaster of Protestant armies. This shocked Catholic opinion across Europe. The Pope protested. Spanish diplomats accused France of betraying Christendom, but Richelieu was unmoved. He understood that in the emerging world of sovereign nation-states, religious solidarity mattered less than strategic advantage. The result was escalation. Spanish troops marched from the Netherlands to reinforce imperial forces in Germany. French armies invaded Spanish-controlled territories in Italy and the Low Countries. Sweden continued operations in northern Germany with French financial support. The war spread across the continent, consuming more territories, killing more soldiers, devastating more civilian populations. Germany became a wasteland. The war had been raging for 17 years by 1635. Armies had marched and countermarched across the same territories repeatedly. Crops had been burned or confiscated so many times that farmers stopped planting. Villages that had been looted by imperial forces would be looted again by Swedish forces, then by French forces, then by whoever else passed through. Populations that had initially fled into forests or walled cities eventually had nowhere left to flee. Disease spread unchecked. Plague, typhus, dysentery swept through armies and civilian populations alike. Soldiers carried infections from town to town. Refugees brought disease to previously healthy areas. Medical knowledge was primitive. Treatment was ineffective. People died by the tens of thousands, sometimes by the hundreds of thousands. Starvation became endemic. With agriculture disrupted, with trade routes destroyed, with livestock confiscated by passing armies, food supplies collapsed. People ate bark, ate leather, ate things that would normally be considered inedible. Contemporary accounts describe parents abandoning children because they could not feed them, described corpses lying in streets because there was no one healthy enough to bury them, describe entire villages where everyone had died. The population of the Holy Roman Empire dropped catastrophically. Estimates vary, but most historians believe the empire lost between 30 and 40% of its population during the 30 Years' War. Some regions lost more. Württemberg may have lost 70% of its population, Brandenburg 60%, Pomerania 50%. These were not primarily battlefield casualties. Most deaths came from disease, starvation, and violence against civilians. Soldiers killed peasants who resisted requisitions. Mercenaries murdered entire families to steal food or valuables. Disease killed indiscriminately. Starvation killed the weak. Children, elderly, those already sick. The 30 Years' War destroyed Germany's economy. Cities that had been prosperous trade centers became ruins. Industries collapsed. Banking systems failed. The wealth accumulated over centuries was consumed in less than 2 decades. And still the war continued. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Neither side could accept defeat. So armies continued to march, battles continued to be fought, and people continued to die. Part 20. Sweden's Triumph and Exhaustion. Sweden emerged from the 30 Years' War as a recognized great power. Even if the size of the Swedish military was smaller than the other great powers of the era, no one could match the quality of the troops that Sweden could mount. Sweden had superior training, superior tactics, superior strategy. And with Gustavus Adolphus innovations, for some time Sweden also enjoyed superior technology. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 gave Sweden control over Swedish Pomerania, Wismar, and the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden. These territories gave Sweden control over key Baltic ports, over the mouths of major German rivers, over trade routes that could generate substantial customs revenue. Sweden also gained a permanent seat in imperial politics. Swedish representatives attended meetings of the Imperial Diet. Sweden became a guarantor of the Peace of Westphalia, meaning Sweden had the legal right to intervene in imperial affairs if the peace terms were violated. It was a triumph. Gustavus Adolphus's invasion of Germany, initially seen as reckless overreach, had transformed Sweden into a Baltic empire, a power that could not be ignored, a kingdom whose military might and diplomatic influence extended far beyond its small population base. But the triumph came at a staggering cost. Tens of thousands of Swedish soldiers had died in Germany. Exact figures are difficult to determine because record-keeping was inconsistent, but estimates suggest that between 50 and 70,000 Swedes served in Germany during the 30 Years' War, and perhaps half of them never returned home. They died in battle, died from disease, died from wounds that became infected, or simply disappeared into the chaos of war. The financial cost was equally devastating. Sweden's treasury was drained. The kingdom was deeply in debt to Dutch and French creditors. The contributions from occupied German territories had helped support military operations during the war, but those revenues disappeared once the war ended, and Sweden no longer controlled those areas. The Swedish economy was strained to the breaking point. Agriculture had been disrupted by conscription. Farmers pulled from fields to serve as soldiers. Trade had been disrupted by war. Industries had been repurposed to support military needs. The kingdom needed peace to recover, needed time to rebuild finances, to repay debts, to allow the population to recuperate. But peace brought new problems. Sweden had built a large professional army to fight the 30 Years' War. At its peak, Swedish forces numbered over 100,000 men, including Swedish, Finnish, German, and other mercenary troops. That army could not simply be disbanded. Professional soldiers had no other trades, no farms to return to. Discharge them without pay, and they would become bandits, would terrorize civilian populations, would destabilize the kingdom. So Sweden kept a large standing army even after the war ended. This required continued high taxation, continued conscription, continued military expenditures that the economy could barely support. The Swedish military establishment became a monster that consumed the kingdom. It required feeding, money, supplies, recruits, but provided diminishing returns. Sweden was at peace, so the army was not conquering new territories or extracting contributions from enemies. But the army still had to be maintained because it represented Swedish power, Swedish security, Swedish status as a great power. Sweden was trapped. The empire Gustavus Adolphus had built required military strength to defend. But maintaining that military strength drained resources that could have been used for economic development. Sweden could not afford to demobilize, but it also could not afford to maintain its military establishment indefinitely. This was the fundamental problem that would plague Sweden for the next century and ultimately lead to the empire's collapse. Part 21. The personal tragedy, Maria Eleonora's grief. While Sweden struggled with the geopolitical and economic consequences of Gustavus Adolphus's death, his widow Maria Eleonora descended into a grief so profound, so consuming, that it became a kind of madness. Maria Eleonora had adored her husband. She had married him in 1620 when she was 16 years old, a political alliance between Sweden and Brandenburg that happened to be, by royal standards, a genuine love match. Gustavus Adolphus was 25, already a seasoned warrior but not yet the legendary figure he would become. They had 12 years together, years frequently interrupted by his military campaigns, but marked by deep affection. Maria Eleonora had begged to accompany Gustavus Adolphus to Germany in 1630. She wanted to be near him, to share his triumphs, to provide comfort and support. He refused. War was no place for a queen. She obeyed, but resentfully, fearfully. She had nightmares about his death, premonitions that he would not return. When news of his death reached her, Maria Eleonora collapsed. Not metaphorically, she literally collapsed, falling to the floor, unable to stand, screaming until her voice gave out. Attendants carried her to her chambers where she remained for days, refusing food, refusing to speak coherently, alternating between silent catatonia and fits of hysterical sobbing. When Gustavus Adolphus's body was returned to Sweden, it had been embalmed, placed in a copper coffin, transported from Lutzen to Stockholm over several months. Maria Eleonora insisted the coffin be placed in her chambers. She wanted him near her. She would sit beside the coffin for hours, speaking to it as though Gustavus Adolphus could hear, describing her day, asking his advice, weeping. The Regency Council tried to convince her to allow the burial. It was unseemly to keep a corpse unburied for months. It was unhealthy. It was disturbing to everyone who witnessed it. Maria Eleonora refused. She would not be separated from her husband. Eventually, after nearly a year, the council forcibly removed the coffin. They held a state funeral in June 1633, burying Gustavus Adolphus in the Ridderholm Church, with full royal honors. Maria Eleonora did not attend. She remained in her chambers, too devastated to function. She never recovered. For the rest of her life, she lived until 1655. Maria Eleonora remained trapped in grief. She neglected her daughter Christina, the young queen who desperately needed maternal guidance and affection. She withdrew from court life, from politics, from all normal activities. She became a ghost haunting the royal palace, a reminder of what had been lost. Christina grew up essentially motherless. She was raised by the Regency Council, educated by tutors, trained in statecraft and languages and history. She became brilliant, eccentric, intellectually voracious. But she also grew up lonely, craving affection that was never provided, developing a deep ambivalence about her role as queen. This too was part of Gustavus Adolphus's legacy. He left behind not just a kingdom, but a broken family, a widow destroyed by grief and a daughter who would grow to resent the crown she inherited. Part 22. The Military Revolution. How Gustavus Adolphus Changed Warfare Forever. To understand Gustavus Adolphus's true legacy, we must examine not what he conquered but what he created. A revolution in military affairs that fundamentally transformed how European wars were fought. Before Gustavus Adolphus, European armies were slow, cumbersome institutions. Infantry formations were massive, deep, inflexible. Artillery was treated as a static siege weapon. Cavalry charged in disorganized masses. Armies moved sluggishly, required enormous logistical tails, struggled to coordinate different arms. Gustavus Adolphus changed all of this, building on reforms pioneered by Maurice of Nassau and other Dutch commanders, but implementing them at a scale and with a thoroughness that previous reformers had only theorized. Infantry reform. Gustavus Adolphus's most visible innovation was thinning infantry formations. Where tercio stood 30 or 40 ranks deep, Swedish infantry formed just 6 ranks deep. This had multiple advantages. First, it made formations more flexible. A 30-rank tercio was essentially a block. It could move forward or back, but struggled to turn, to wheel, to respond to changing battlefield conditions. A 6-rank formation could maneuver quickly, could form different shapes, could redeploy in response to enemy movements. Second, it allowed more soldiers to fight. In a 30-rank formation, only the front few ranks could actually engage the enemy. The men in the back stood idle, their weapons useless, their presence merely adding weight. In a 6-rank formation, almost everyone could contribute. The first 3 ranks fired volleys. The second 3 ranks loaded and prepared to step forward, and pikemen provided protection against cavalry. Third, it improved firepower efficiency. By drilling Swedish musketeers relentlessly, Gustavus Adolphus achieved firing rates that were astonishing by early 17th century standards. Swedish infantry could fire volleys every 30 seconds, load, aim, fire, reload, with mechanical precision. 3 ranks firing in succession meant a Swedish battalion could deliver devastating, continuous fire. The key was training. Swedish soldiers drilled constantly. They practiced the complex sequence of loading a matchlock musket, pour powder down the barrel, insert ball, ram it home, prime the pan, blow on the match, aim, fire, until they could do it without thinking, could do it while exhausted, could do it under fire while men fell around them. This was revolutionary. Most European armies treated infantry as disposable masses. Peasants given weapons and minimal training, expected to stand in formation and follow orders, but not expected to perform complex maneuvers. Gustavus Adolphus treated infantry as professionals requiring extensive training and capable of sophisticated tactical actions. Artillery innovation. Gustavus Adolphus revolutionized field artillery. Before his reforms, cannon were cumbersome siege weapons. They were cast in wildly varying sizes, required enormous crews to move, fired slowly, and were generally positioned at the start of battle and left there. Gustavus Adolphus standardized artillery. Swedish cannon came in a small number of fixed sizes: 3-pounders, 6-pounders, 12-pounders. Ammunition was interchangeable. Replacement parts were interchangeable. Training was transferable. More importantly, Swedish artillery was lighter. Gustavus Adolphus worked with Swedish and Dutch gunsmiths to design cannon that were powerful but portable. A Swedish 3-pounder could be moved by a single horse. A 6-pounder required 2 horses. This meant Swedish artillery could be repositioned during battle, could follow advancing infantry, could be brought forward to exploit breakthroughs, or withdrawn to prevent capture. Swedish artillery crews were trained to work quickly. They could unlimber, aim, fire, and limber again in minutes. They practiced coordinating with infantry, providing fire support for advances, suppressing enemy positions. The result was that Swedish artillery became a dynamic battlefield asset rather than a static one. Commanders could adjust artillery positions multiple times during a battle, concentrating fire where it was needed most. Cavalry doctrine. Gustavus Adolphus also reformed cavalry tactics, though this was perhaps his least original innovation, building heavily on Polish and German models. Swedish cavalry charged at full gallop, relying on shock and momentum. But they also carried firearms, pistols, and eventually carbines, allowing them to fire into enemy formations before contact. And they were trained to reform quickly after a charge, to rally and charge again, rather than pursuing defeated enemies off the battlefield and becoming useless for the rest of the engagement. Swedish cavalry was organized into squadrons of moderate size, a few hundred men each, rather than massive formations of thousands. This made them more maneuverable, easier to control, capable of responding to changing situations. Combined arms coordination. Perhaps Gustavus Adolphus's greatest contribution was not any single tactical innovation, but the integration of different arms into a mutually supporting system. Infantry provided firepower and could hold ground. Pikemen within infantry formations protected musketeers from cavalry charges. Artillery supported infantry advances and suppressed enemy positions. Cavalry protected flanks, exploited breakthroughs, pursued defeated enemies. Each arm supported the others. If enemy cavalry threatened Swedish infantry, pikemen formed defensive squares while musketeers fired volleys and artillery poured canister shot into charging horsemen. If enemy infantry tried to close with Swedish forces, cavalry charges disrupted their formations, while artillery and musketry tore them apart from a distance. This required intensive training and sophisticated command and control. Officers needed to coordinate different arms, to adjust plans based on battlefield developments, to communicate orders clearly under chaotic conditions. Swedish officers were trained extensively in combined arms operations, practiced coordinating infantry, artillery, and cavalry in exercises, and were given significant tactical autonomy to make decisions without waiting for orders from Supreme Command. Logistics and administration. Gustavus Adolphus also revolutionized military logistics, though this is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic, tactical innovations. He created a sophisticated supply system. Swedish armies moved with supply wagons organized into trains, with designated routes and schedules. Depots were established at regular intervals along lines of march, stocked with food, ammunition, and fodder. Quartermasters tracked supplies, maintained inventories, and reported shortages. This allowed Swedish armies to move faster and more reliably than opponents. Armies that relied on foraging or irregular supply systems moved slowly, often had to stop for days to gather supplies, and suffered from unpredictable shortages that sapped combat effectiveness. Gustavus Adolphus also reformed military pay and finance. Swedish soldiers were paid regularly, monthly, rather than irregularly or annually. This reduced mutinies, improved morale, and allowed commanders to maintain discipline because soldiers knew payment was coming and did not need to loot to survive. Training and professionalism. Underlying all these reforms was Gustavus Adolphus's insistence on training and professionalism. Swedish soldiers were not peasants given pikes and told to stand in formation. They were professionals who trained constantly, who understood their role in the larger tactical system, who could execute complex maneuvers under fire. Officers were promoted based on merit rather than solely on birth. Competent commoners could become officers. Incompetent nobles could be cashiered. This created an officer corps that was capable, experienced, and committed to professional excellence. Legacy. After Gustavus Adolphus's death, European armies gradually adopted Swedish methods. Thin infantry formations became standard. Mobile artillery became common. Combined arms coordination became doctrine. Training and professionalism became expectations rather than exceptions. The military revolution Gustavus Adolphus exemplified, though he did not cause it single-handedly, fundamentally changed warfare. Battles became more decisive. Armies became more lethal. The advantage shifted to states that could afford professional standing armies, extensive training, and sophisticated logistics. This had profound political consequences. Wars became more expensive, requiring centralized states with effective tax systems. Feudal levies became obsolete, replaced by professional soldiers loyal to the state rather than to local lords. Military power concentrated in the hands of central governments, accelerating the development of absolutist monarchies and the modern nation-state. Gustavus Adolphus did not intend to cause a political revolution. He simply wanted to win battles, to defend Sweden, to establish Swedish power. But the methods he used to achieve those goals transformed not just warfare, but the entire structure of European politics. Part 23. The Doctrine of GoPo, Aggressive Spirit and Tactical Philosophy. While the term GoPo is often linked to the Swedish soldiers of the next century, its DNA was written in the blood and mud of the 30 Years' War by Gustavus Adolphus. He was the one who realized that in the chaos of black powder smoke, the side that hesitates is the side that dies. He didn't just want his men to fire. He wanted them to encroach. He trained his infantry to march into the kill zone and stay there, closing the distance until they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. It was a psychological meat grinder. By the time a Swedish regiment unleashed its volley, they were so close that the impact wasn't just physical, it was a total collapse of the enemy's will to stand. Aggressive spirit and tactical philosophy. Central to Swedish military success was a tactical philosophy, encapsulated in the Swedish phrase, go på, literally go at or go forward, colloquially attack. It represented a fundamental approach to warfare that privileged aggression, initiative, and decisive action over caution and defensive posture. Go på was not recklessness. It was calculated aggression, based on the understanding that in early modern warfare, Offensive action often provided decisive advantages. Attacking forces could choose the time and place of engagement, could force defenders to react rather than act, could maintain momentum that was psychologically and tactically valuable. Gustavus Adolphus drilled this philosophy into Swedish officers and soldiers at every level. Swedish doctrine emphasized taking the initiative, attacking enemy weak points, maintaining pressure, never allowing opponents time to recover or regroup. This manifested in several ways on the battlefield. Aggressive deployment. Swedish forces deployed close to enemy positions, often dangerously close by contemporary standards. This reduced the time opponents had to prepare for engagement, limited their ability to maneuver, and allowed Swedish artillery to engage immediately at effective range. Rapid attacks. Swedish infantry advanced quickly, rather than slowly. They moved at a steady pace, fired volleys while advancing, and closed with enemy positions before defenders could fully respond. This was psychologically devastating. Defending forces watched Swedish formations advancing under fire, maintaining discipline despite casualties, never stopping or wavering. Pursuit. Swedish forces pursued defeated enemies aggressively. Where other armies often allowed defeated opponents to retreat and regroup, Swedish forces followed up victories immediately, capturing artillery, destroying supply trains, preventing rally. This turned tactical victories into strategic routes. Tactical flexibility also meant adapting quickly to changing circumstances. Swedish officers were trained to recognize opportunities and exploit them without waiting for orders. If an enemy flank was exposed, attack it. If enemy artillery positions were vulnerable, seize them. If the enemy line showed signs of breaking, press the advantage. This required trust between command levels. Senior commanders had to trust that junior officers would make sound tactical decisions. Junior officers had to trust that senior commanders would support their initiatives. This trust was built through training, through shared experience, and through Gustavus Adolphus's personal example. Psychological impact. The psychological impact of this aggressive demeanor was significant. Enemies facing Swedish forces knew they would be attacked. There would be no cautious maneuvering, no extended standoffs. Swedes attacked. This knowledge created anxiety, defensive mindsets, hesitation. Swedish soldiers, conversely, were trained to believe in their offensive power, to trust that their training and tactics gave them advantages, to expect that aggressive action would lead to victory. This confidence was self-reinforcing. Victories confirmed that aggressive demeanor worked, which made soldiers more willing to attack aggressively in future engagements. Risks. Aggressive demeanor was not without risks. Aggressive tactics could lead to overextension, could expose attacking forces to counterattacks, could result in heavy casualties if attacks failed. Gustavus Adolphus managed these risks through reconnaissance, through ensuring artillery support, through maintaining reserves that could exploit breakthroughs or cover retreats. But he also accepted that aggressive tactics meant accepting higher casualty rates. Swedish forces often suffered heavier losses than if they had fought defensively, but they won battles. Cultural dimension. The aggressive demeanor also reflected something cultural about how Swedes approached challenges. There was a Protestant work ethic dimension. Success came through discipline, effort, and willingness to confront difficulties head-on. There was also a Northern European pragmatism. Resources were limited, so campaigns had to be decisive. Victories had to be achieved quickly before attrition eroded advantages. This contrasts with Southern European military cultures that often emphasized honor, elaborate fortifications, lengthy sieges, and cautious maneuvering. Swedish doctrine was more direct. Identify the enemy, attack the enemy, defeat the enemy, move on. Part 24. The decline begins, Sweden's slow collapse. The decades following Gustavus Adolphus's death saw Sweden maintain its great power status, but at increasing cost. The Swedish Empire appeared formidable, controlling territories in Germany, dominating the Baltic, commanding respect and prestige from the other European powers. But beneath the surface, structural weaknesses were growing. The problem of distance. Sweden's empire was geographically fragmented. Swedish Pomerania was hundreds of miles from Stockholm. Bremen and Verden even farther. Riga and Livonia were across the Baltic. These territories could not be easily defended, could not be economically integrated, required garrisons and administrators and constant attention. Distance also meant that Swedish control was tenuous. When wars erupted, Swedish reinforcements took weeks or months to arrive. Local populations resented Swedish rule, resisted Swedish taxation, supported any enemy who promised liberation. Demographic limitations. Sweden's population remained small, perhaps 1.5 million by the mid-17th century. This was a fraction of France's 20 million, or the Holy Roman Empire's 16 million, or Poland's 11 million. Every Swedish soldier sent abroad was a farmer not working his land, a craftsman not producing goods, a potential father not raising children. Sweden tried to compensate by recruiting foreign mercenaries and incorporating conquered territories into the Swedish military system. But mercenaries were expensive and unreliable. Conquered populations resented conscription, and neither truly solved the fundamental problem. Sweden's manpower base was too small to sustain a vast empire. Economic strain. The Swedish economy could not support the military establishment Sweden maintained. Copper and iron exports provided some revenue, but not enough. Grain production was sufficient for domestic needs, but left little surplus for export. Trade generated customs duties, but Swedish merchants could not compete with Dutch and English rivals who had better ships, better credit, better commercial networks. Sweden relied on war to fund war. Contributions from occupied territories supported Swedish armies abroad. Plunder supplemented regular pay. Conquered lands were distributed to Swedish nobles to create incentives for military service. But this system only worked while Sweden was winning. Once Sweden stopped expanding, once territories were lost or contributions decreased, the entire edifice became unsustainable. Aristocratic resurgence. The Swedish nobility, suppressed under Gustavus Adolphus and his father, gradually reclaimed power during Christina's minority. They demanded restoration of confiscated lands. They insisted on control over government offices. They limited royal authority, forcing monarchs to consult the council of the realm, to seek aristocratic approval for major decisions. This weakened the Swedish state. Centralized authority, the foundation of Swedish military success, eroded. Policies became inconsistent. Resources were diverted to aristocratic interests rather than state needs. Christina's abdication. Queen Christina's abdication in 1654 shocked Europe. A queen abandoning her throne, converting to Catholicism, leaving Sweden to live in Rome. It was scandalous, politically destabilizing, ideologically troubling. Christina had never wanted to be queen. She found statecraft boring, found the expectations placed on her suffocating. She was intellectually brilliant, but temperamentally unsuited for the grinding work of governance. Her abdication was both personal liberation and political disaster. Her successor, Karl X Gustav, or Charles X for you English speakers, was a capable military leader who tried to restore Swedish martial glory through aggressive wars against Poland, Denmark, and Russia. He won spectacular victories, including the famous march across the frozen Baltic in 1658. But these victories came at enormous cost in Swedish lives and resources. The Great Northern War. The final blow came during the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721. Sweden faced a coalition of Russia, Denmark, Poland, and Saxony, all determined to strip away Swedish territories and reduce Swedish power. King Charles XII, or Karl den XII in Swedish, Gustavus Adolphus's great-great-grandson, was a military genius in the traditional Swedish mold. He won stunning victories against overwhelming odds. He defeated Russia at Narva, invaded Poland, marched deep into Russia, pursuing Tsar Peter the Great. But genius could not overcome mathematics. Russia was too large, too populous, too resilient. Charles XII's army penetrated deep into Ukraine, far from supply bases, harassed by Russian forces, suffering from hunger and cold. At the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Russian forces destroyed the Swedish army. Karl fled to Ottoman territory, spent years in exile, returned to Sweden to find his empire crumbling. He was killed in 1718, shot during a siege in Norway. Whether by enemy fire or by assassination remains debated. The Great Northern War ended with the Treaty of Nystad in 1721. Sweden lost its German territories, lost control of the Baltic, lost its status as a great power. The Swedish Empire, which had dominated Northern Europe for nearly a century, was gone. Part 25. Reflections on Power, Ambition, and the Cost of Glory. What, then, do we make of Gustavus Adolphus? How do we evaluate a man who built an empire that lasted barely a century, who revolutionized warfare but left his kingdom exhausted, who became a legend but died at 37 in a muddy field, far from home? The hero narrative. Traditional accounts lionize Gustavus Adolphus. He is the Protestant champion who saved Germany from Catholic tyranny, the military genius who revolutionized warfare, the great king who made Sweden a power. This narrative is not wrong. Gustavus Adolphus did achieve extraordinary things, but it is incomplete. The tragic narrative. An alternative reading sees Gustavus Adolphus as tragic, a brilliant man whose ambitions exceeded what his small kingdom could sustain, who built an empire that Sweden could not hold, whose death left a power vacuum that destabilized Northern Europe. This narrative is also incomplete. The complex reality. Gustavus Adolphus was both hero and tragic figure. He was a man of genuine religious conviction, who used religion cynically to justify political ambitions. He was a reformer who modernized warfare while conducting campaigns that devastated civilian populations. He was a loving father who left his daughter orphaned. He was a military genius whose victories planted seeds of future disasters. Structural determinism versus individual agency. How much did Gustavus Adolphus shape events? And how much did events shape him? Was Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War inevitable, given strategic realities? Or was it the product of one man's ambition? The truth is probably both. The strategic situation created opportunities and pressures that would have influenced any Swedish king. But Gustavus Adolphus's particular genius, his specific capabilities and psychology, shaped how Sweden responded. A different king might have focused on defensive consolidation rather than aggressive expansion. Gustavus Adolphus chose offense, and that choice reshaped Europe. The irony of success. Gustavus Adolphus succeeded brilliantly at his immediate goals, defeating imperial forces, establishing Swedish power, securing Protestant interests. But that success created the conditions for Sweden's eventual failure. The empire was too large, too expensive, too dependent on constant warfare to survive his death. This is the fundamental irony, that Gustavus Adolphus's greatest achievements contained the seeds of their own destruction. He built so well that the structure could not be sustained. He achieved so much that Sweden could not match it again. The question of morality. Was Gustavus Adolphus's intervention in Germany morally justified? He claimed to fight for Protestant religious freedom, to prevent Catholic tyranny. But his campaigns killed tens of thousands, devastated territories, prolonged a war that might have ended earlier with less bloodshed. The moral calculus is impossible. Would German Protestantism have survived without Swedish intervention? Probably not in its existing form. Would Germany have suffered less if Sweden had stayed neutral? Possibly, though the war was already catastrophic before Swedish involvement. Gustavus Adolphus believed he was doing God's work. He believed deeply that he was an instrument of divine will, that Protestant survival depended on Swedish arms. This belief was sincere, but sincerity does not make actions right, and good intentions do not erase consequences. Legacy. Gustavus Adolphus's real legacy is not territorial gains, which were eventually lost, but the transformation of military practice. The reforms he championed became standard across Europe. Professional standing armies, mobile artillery, thin infantry formations, combined arms coordination. These became the foundations of modern warfare. He also left a legacy of Swedish national identity. Swedes today remember Gustavus Adolphus as a golden age, as proof that their small nation could achieve greatness. This memory shapes Swedish self-conception, even as modern Sweden has long abandoned military adventurism in favor of neutrality and social democracy. The human cost. But we should also remember the costs. The soldiers who died in frozen fields. The civilians who starved because armies consumed their food. The families destroyed. The economies ruined. The generation of Germans who grew up knowing only war. Gustavus Adolphus did not cause the 30 Years' War. He did not create the religious hatreds that tore Europe apart. But he escalated the conflict, lengthened it, made it more lethal. His military genius made killing more efficient. This is uncomfortable. We want our heroes uncomplicated. But Gustavus Adolphus was not uncomplicated. He was brilliant and ruthless, pious and calculating, visionary and short-sighted. He achieved extraordinary things and left behind catastrophic consequences. The lesson. If there is a lesson in Gustavus Adolphus's life, it might be this: that ambition, even righteous ambition, has costs. That power, even when wielded brilliantly, corrupts and destroys. That glory, even when earned, is fleeting. That empires, even when built with genius, crumble. Gustavus Adolphus wanted to secure Sweden's future, to defend Protestantism, to achieve lasting greatness. He succeeded at all of these, temporarily. But nothing lasts. Empires rise and fall. Victories turn to defeats. Heroes become cautionary tales. The snow falls on Stockholm. In the Riddarholm Church, Gustavus Adolphus's remains lie in a copper sarcophagus, surrounded by kings and queens, whose names are forgotten by all but historians. Once a year, on the anniversary of Lutzen, a small ceremony is held. But the world has moved on. What remains is memory. Complicated, contested memory. Memory of a man who changed history, who revolutionized warfare, who built an empire that could not last. Memory of victories and defeats, of brilliance and tragedy, of ambition and its consequences. The Lion of the North, the Protestant champion, the warrior king, the man who died in the fog at Lutzen, far from home, believing he was doing God's work. Was he right? Was he wrong? We cannot know. History does not provide answers, only questions. And the snow keeps falling. Epilogue. The empty throne. The snow falls on Stockholm, as it has fallen for centuries, silent and relentless. The royal palace stands illuminated against the winter darkness, a monument to power that no longer exists, to an empire that crumbled, to kings and queens who ruled and died and are now just names. In the Riddarholm Church, tourists walk past Gustavus Adolphus's sarcophagus, glancing briefly at the copper coffin, reading the placard that summarizes his life in a few sentences. They move on to the next tomb, the next artifact, the next piece of history packaged for consumption. Few pause to truly consider what lies beneath that copper surface. The body of a man who reshaped Europe, the remains of a king who made Sweden great and set it on a path to decline, the dust of someone who believed absolutely in his cause and paid for that belief with his life. Outside, Stockholm continues. A modern city, prosperous, peaceful, social, democratic. A country that has not fought a war in over 2 centuries, that prides itself on neutrality and humanitarian values. The Sweden of Gustavus Adolphus, militaristic, aggressive, hungry for empire, seems alien, a nightmare from which the nation has awakened. But the legacy remains, subtle and pervasive. The belief that Sweden can punch above its weight. The conviction that small nations can influence events through excellence and innovation. The memory of a time when Sweden mattered on the world stage. And perhaps the warning that greatness is temporary, that empires built on military might cannot last, that the costs of glory often exceed its rewards. In a museum in Stockholm, there is a blood-stained leather vest, torn by musket balls, recovered from Gustavus Adolphus's body after Lutzen. Visitors look at it, this tangible artifact of violence and mortality, and perhaps reflect on the fragility of human ambition, the inevitability of death, the futility of seeking immortality through conquest. But probably not. Probably they take a photo, post it to social media, move on to the next exhibit. The past is distant, irrelevant, interesting only as spectacle. And maybe that is the final irony. Gustavus Adolphus wanted to be remembered, wanted his name to echo through history, wanted immortality through achievement. He got his wish. But the memory is faded, simplified, reduced to tourist attractions and history lessons that students will forget by next semester. The snow falls. The city continues. And in the Riddarholm church, Gustavus Adolphus lies silent, surrounded by the dust of other kings, other queens, other people who once believed they were important, that their actions mattered, that history would remember them. It does remember, but not in the way they hoped. Not as vindication, but as warning. The iron crown he wore was heavy. In the end, it crushed him. And the empire he built crumbled after him, unable to sustain the weight of ambitions too grand for a kingdom too small. This is the story of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, the Protestant champion, the warrior king, the man who changed warfare and built an empire, and died at 37. His story is over. The snow keeps falling, and in the silence, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of drums, of cannon fire, of soldiers marching through German mud, of a king riding through fog toward his death, believing until the very end that he was doing something that mattered, something that would last. He was wrong about the lasting part, but perhaps he was right that it mattered. Perhaps that is enough. The snow falls on Stockholm. The past is past. The future is unknowable. And in between, for a brief moment, there was a man who believed he could change the world. He did, but he never got a chance to see the outcome. Now it is time for us to return to our own time, to our own lives. Perhaps we too can change the world around us. Perhaps not in such a grand way as Gustavus Adolphus, but still. Change it, make an impact. Anything, something, and perhaps then we too will be remembered. Personal closing words. I have hesitated for the longest of times before I created this video. Somehow this story feels very important to me, and I really wanted it to turn out good. I have put enormous effort and time into this project, both towards the script and the use of images. As you can tell, there is a lot of images in this video, and they've taken a long time to generate. I hope you guys can tell the extra effort I have put into this video. It's taken a long time to complete, and now when it's done, it feels great to finally share it with you guys. The story of Gustavus Adolphus, or Gustav den Andre Adolf, as we say in Sweden, is remarkably similar to that of Charles XII. Both came into power in their youth. Both monarchs followed an almost identical trajectory that began with a quick knockout of Russia, only to get bogged down in the political and military quagmire of Poland. Both kings started their reigns by quickly humbling a numerically superior but disorganized Russia. Gustavus Adolphus, early in his reign, he won the Ingrian War between 1610 and 1617 against Russia. By the Treaty of Stolbovo, he successfully cut Russia off from the Baltic Sea entirely, securing a massive victory that made him believe the Russian threat was handled. Charles XII, he won the legendary Battle of Narva at 1700, where his 10,000 Swedes routed a Russian army of 40,000. Like Gustavus, He assumed Russia was no longer a serious threat and turned his back on them to focus elsewhere. 2. The Polish quagmire. After defeating Russia, both kings spent years fruitlessly chasing a decisive political solution in Poland-Lithuania. Gustavus Adolphus. He spent 8 years, between 1621 and 1629, fighting the Polish-Swedish War. Despite winning battle after battle, he could never force the Polish king, his cousin Sigismund III, to renounce his claim to the Swedish throne. It became a war of attrition that drained Swedish resources until the Truce of Altmark finally allowed him to leave for Germany. Charles XII. After Narva, he spent 6 years, between 1701 and 1706, campaigning across Poland trying to dethrone Augustus the Strong. While he won brilliant tactical victories at places like Klisov, the vastness of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth made it impossible to finish the war. 3. The fatal consequence. The quagmire in Poland is ultimately what led to the fall of the Swedish Empire under Charles XII. While he was busy in Poland, Peter the Great was busy modernizing the Russian army and building St. Petersburg on Swedish land. By the time Charles finally finished in Poland and turned back to Russia, he faced a completely different, much stronger enemy, leading directly to his crushing defeat at Poltava. In contrast, Gustavus Adolphus was lucky enough to finish his Polish quagmire and pivot to the 30 Years' War in Germany before Russia could recover, which is why he is remembered as the empire's builder and Charles as its liquidator. Do you think Charles XII's obsession with dethroning the Polish king was his biggest mistake? Or was a clash with a modernizing Russia inevitable anyway? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. I really hope you enjoyed your time here with me. And as always, I hope to see you all in the next one.